Behind the walls of Vatican City, in climate-controlled rooms far beneath St. Peter's Basilica, sit 53 miles of shelving. The temperature never changes, the humidity stays constant, and on those shelves rest documents that chronicle 8 centuries of power, intrigue, and decisions that shape the world you live in today. Some of these papers were never meant to see daylight, others were deliberately hidden, their content so controversial that merely reading them could have meant death. Before we begin this journey through history's most guarded archive, take a moment. Forget about time. Let the day fall away. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'm curious to know how far these stories travel. The Vatican Secret Archives changed their name in 2019. They're now called the Vatican Apostolic Archives because the word secret had become problematic. But that name change doesn't erase what these documents contain. It doesn't change the fact that for most of history, these papers were locked away from everyone except a select few. And it certainly doesn't erase the centuries of decisions, scandals, and power plays that are recorded in ink on parchment and paper within those temperature-controlled rooms. The archives as we know them today were formally established in 1612 by Pope Paul V, but the documents inside stretch back much further. Some date to the 8th century. The oldest materials include papal letters, theological disputes, records of excommunications, and correspondence with kings and emperors. But the truly fascinating material begins in the medieval period, when the Catholic Church wasn't just a religious institution. It was the most powerful political force in Europe, and the popes wielded more influence than most monarchs. In 1209, Pope Innocent III launched what would become one of the bloodiest campaigns in medieval history. The Albigensian Crusade targeted the Cathars, a Christian sect in southern France who rejected the authority of the Catholic Church and believed the material world was created by an evil god. The Cathars had grown numerous and influential, particularly among the nobility of Languedoc. They posed a direct threat to Catholic dominance in the region. Innocent III didn't simply want to convert the Cathars, he wanted them eliminated. When his diplomatic efforts failed, he called for a crusade, promising the same spiritual rewards and material gains that crusaders receive for fighting in the Holy Land. Northern French nobles, eager for land and plunder, answered the call. The papal legate leading the campaign, Arnaud Amalric, arrived at the city of Béziers in July 1209. The city's Catholic inhabitants refused to surrender the Cathars living among them. What happened next became infamous. When soldiers asked Amalric how to distinguish between Catholics and Cathars during the attack, he allegedly replied with words that would echo through history, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Whether he actually spoke those exact words remains debated, but the sentiment was clear. The Crusaders stormed Béziers and engaged in an indiscriminate slaughter. Between 7,000 and 20,000 people died that day. Men, women and children were cut down in the streets. Some sought refuge in the Church of Mary Magdalene. The soldiers burned it with everyone inside. The Albigensian Crusade continued for 2 decades. Entire towns were destroyed. The culture of Languedoc, with its troubadours and relatively tolerant society, was shattered. The Cathars were driven underground, hunted relentlessly until the sect effectively ceased to exist. The final Cathar stronghold, the fortress of Montségur, fell in 1244. More than 200 Cathars who refused to renounce their faith were burned alive in a mass execution. Documents related to the Crusade sit in the Vatican archives. Correspondence between Innocent III and his legates, instructions on how to proceed, reports on the progress of the campaign. These papers reveal the calculated nature of the Church's actions. This wasn't spontaneous religious fervour. It was organised, deliberate destruction carried out with papal approval and guidance. The methods used during the Albigensian Crusade would later be refined and institutionalised. The medieval Inquisition emerged partly as a response to the Cathar heresy. Pope Gregory IX established it in 1231, creating a formal system for identifying, interrogating and punishing heretics. The Inquisition would evolve over centuries, spreading across Europe and eventually to the New World, leaving a trail of suffering that the Church would spend centuries trying to justify or forget. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to the 13th century, to another controversy that reveals the Vatican's relationship with power and money. In 1302, Pope Boniface VIII issued a papal bull called Unum Sanctum. It's one of the most extreme assertions of papal authority ever written. The document declared that submission to the Pope was necessary for salvation. It stated that the Pope had authority over all earthly rulers, that spiritual power was superior to temporal power, and that kings and emperors ultimately answered to the papacy. Boniface VIII was locked in a power struggle with King Philip IV of France. Philip had imposed taxes on the French clergy without papal permission, directly challenging the Church's claim to independence from secular authority. Boniface responded with threats and ultimatums. Unam Sanctam was his most aggressive move, a declaration that he outranked every monarch in Christendom. Philip wasn't intimidated. In September 1303, he sent a small force led by Guillaume de Nogaret to arrest the Pope at his residence in Anagni, Italy. The king's men broke into the papal palace, confronted Boniface and allegedly struck him. Some accounts claim Nogaret slapped the Pope across the face, others say it was worse. The elderly Pope, humiliated and traumatized, was briefly held captive before local residents drove the French soldiers away. Boniface returned to Rome, but he never recovered from the shock. He died a month later, broken and defeated. His grand claims of papal supremacy died with him. The balance of power had shifted. Kings no longer felt compelled to bow to popes, and the Church's political influence began a slow but irreversible decline. The documents surrounding this incident, including Unam Sanctam itself, remain in the archives. They represent a turning point, a moment when the medieval papacy reached too far and was slapped down. The irony wasn't lost on contemporaries. A pope who claimed ultimate authority over all earthly rulers was humiliated by a French king in his own residence. The 14th century brought more upheaval. From 1309 to 1376, the papacy abandoned Rome entirely and relocated to Avignon in southern France. This period, known as the Avignon Papacy, was effectively a French captivity. 7 consecutive popes lived in Avignon, all of them French, all of them under the influence of the French monarchy. The papacy became an extension of French foreign policy. The Avignon period transformed the Church's financial operations. Cut off from Rome and its traditional revenues, the popes in Avignon developed increasingly creative methods of raising money. They expanded the sale of indulgences, created new church offices that could be purchased, and imposed taxes on clergy across Europe. The papal court in Avignon became notorious for corruption and extravagance. Critics compared it to Babylon, calling this era the Babylonian captivity of the Church. When Pope Gregory XI finally returned to Rome in 1377, he found a city in ruins. The papal bureaucracy had to be rebuilt from scratch. But Gregory died the following year, and the cardinals, under pressure from Roman mobs demanding an Italian pope, elected Urban VI. Urban immediately alienated the cardinals with his harsh reforms and erratic behaviour. A group of cardinals declared his election invalid and chose a rival pope, Clement VII, who returned to Avignon. Thus began the Western Schism, one of the most bizarre episodes in church history. From 1378 to 1417, there were 2 popes, sometimes 3, each claiming to be the legitimate successor to St. Peter. Each pope had his own cardinals, his own supporters, his own territory. Europe split along political lines. France, Scotland and Spain supported the Avignon Pope. England, Germany, and most of Italy supported the Roman Pope. Bishops and theologians argued over which pope was legitimate. Countries switched allegiances based on political convenience. The confusion reached its peak when a church council attempted to resolve the crisis by deposing both popes and electing a third. The existing popes refused to step down, so for a brief period there were 3 men simultaneously claiming to be pope. It was theological chaos. How could there be 3 living vicars of Christ? Which one, if any, had valid authority? Could a council of bishops overrule a pope? The question shook the foundations of church authority. The schism was finally resolved at the Council of Constance in 1417, which managed to get all 3 papal claimants to resign or be deposed and elected Martin V as the single, universally recognised pope. But the damage was done. The schism had revealed the papacy as a political institution, subject to the same power struggles and corruption as any earthly government. The aura of divine authority had been badly tarnished. The Vatican archives contain extensive documentation from this period. Letters between rival popes, arguments over legitimacy, financial records showing how each papal court funded itself. These documents reveal how close the Church came to complete collapse. how theological questions became hopelessly entangled with political ambitions. The 15th century brought new controversies, particularly around the figure of Jan Hus. Hus was a Czech priest and theologian who studied the writings of John Wycliffe, an English reformer who had criticised church corruption and challenged various Catholic doctrines. Hus began preaching similar ideas in Prague. He condemned the sale of indulgences, argued that Scripture should be the ultimate authority rather than church tradition, and criticised the moral failures of the clergy. His ideas gained widespread support in Bohemia, particularly among Czech speakers who resented German dominance in church affairs. Hus became a popular figure, protected by powerful Czech nobles. But his teachings alarmed the church hierarchy. In 1411, Pope John XXIII excommunicated him. Hus continued preaching, his support growing rather than diminishing. In 1414, the Council of Constance summoned Hus to defend his views. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund issued a safe conduct document, guaranteeing Hus's safety regardless of the council's judgment. Hus travelled to Constance, believing he would have a fair hearing. Instead, he was arrested shortly after his arrival. The safe conduct was declared invalid because, the council argued, promises to heretics need not be kept. Hus was imprisoned in terrible conditions. He was interrogated repeatedly, pressured to recant his beliefs. He offered to retract any statement proven wrong by Scripture, but refused to blindly submit to the council's authority. The council demanded complete submission. Hus refused. After months of imprisonment and show trials, he was convicted of heresy. On July 6, 1415, they led him to the execution site. Church officials placed a paper crown on his head decorated with images of demons and the word heretic. They burned his books in front of him. Then they tied him to the stake. As the flames rose, he reportedly sang hymns. His ashes were scattered in the Rhine River to prevent any relics from being collected. The execution of Jan Hus, despite the emperor's guarantee of safe conduct, outraged many in Bohemia. It sparked the Hussite Wars, a series of conflicts that lasted for decades. The Hussites defeated several crusades sent against them, proving that religious dissent backed by military force could resist the combined power of church and empire. Hus became a martyr, his ideas spreading despite the church's attempts to suppress them. A century later, Martin Luther would cite Hus as a predecessor. The Protestant Reformation didn't emerge from nowhere. It had roots in these earlier reform movements, in the critiques of men like Wycliffe and Hus who challenged church authority and paid with their lives. The Vatican archives contain records of Hus's trial, the theological arguments used to condemn him, the political calculations behind his execution. These documents reveal how the Church dealt with dissent, not through debate or reform, but through imprisonment and fire. The late 15th and early 16th centuries are often called the Renaissance papacy, a time when popes acted more like Italian princes than spiritual leaders. Consider Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, who reigned from 1492 to 1503. Alexander wasn't subtle about his worldliness. He had multiple mistresses and acknowledged several illegitimate children, including Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia, whom he promoted to positions of power. Alexander used the papacy to advance his family's political ambitions. He arranged marriages for his children with strategically important families. He granted Cesare a position as cardinal at age 18, despite Cesare's complete lack of religious vocation. When Cesare decided he preferred military conquest to church service, Alexander released him from his vows and helped him carve out a territory in central Italy through warfare and treachery. The Borgia papacy became synonymous with corruption. Stories circulated about wild parties at the Vatican, about murders ordered by Cesare, about poison used to eliminate political enemies. Some of these stories were exaggerated by the Borgia's enemies, but enough were true to create a lasting scandal. This was the papacy at its most worldly, most corrupt, most willing to use spiritual authority for temporal gain. Alexander VI also made one of history's most audacious political moves. In 1494, Spain and Portugal were competing for control of newly discovered lands in the Americas and along the African coast. The two Catholic powers asked the Pope to mediate their dispute. Alexander issued a series of papal bulls that literally divided the world between Spain and Portugal. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494 based on Alexander's ruling, drew a line through the Atlantic Ocean. Everything west of the line belonged to Spain, everything east to Portugal. Think about the presumption involved. The Pope claimed authority to divide continents between Christian monarchs, to assign ownership of lands inhabited by millions of people who had never heard of Christianity. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, Africa, and Asia had no say in their own fate. A line on a map drawn in Rome determined which European power would colonize them. The treaty had lasting consequences. It's why Brazil speaks Portuguese while the rest of South America speaks Spanish. It's why the Portuguese dominated trade with Africa and Asia, while Spain conquered Mexico and Peru. One papal decision shaped centuries of colonial history, affected billions of lives, created linguistic and cultural divisions that persist today. The documents related to the Treaty of Tordesillas remain in the Vatican archives, a reminder of when the Church didn't just claim spiritual authority, but asserted the right to distribute the entire non-Christian world among European powers. The indigenous peoples affected by this decision were never consulted. Their lands, their futures, their very lives were treated as papal gifts to be handed to Christian monarchs. But let's move to perhaps the most famous controversy in the archives, the trial of Galileo Galilei. In the early 17th century, Galileo used his improved telescope to make observations that supported the heliocentric model of the solar system proposed by Copernicus. He observed that Venus went through phases like the Moon, which could only happen if Venus orbited the Sun rather than Earth. He discovered moons orbiting Jupiter, proving that not everything in the heavens revolved around Earth. Galileo's observations contradicted the geocentric model endorsed by the Church, which placed Earth at the centre of the universe. More importantly, they seemed to contradict certain passages of Scripture that describe the Sun moving across the sky. Church authorities warned Galileo to present heliocentrism as a mathematical hypothesis rather than physical reality. For years, Galileo complied, more or less. But in 1632 he published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, which presented arguments for and against heliocentrism. The book was supposed to be balanced, but Galileo's position was obvious. He put the Church's arguments in the mouth of a character named Simplicio, a name that could mean simple-minded. The implication wasn't subtle. Pope Urban VIII, who had been friendly with Galileo, felt betrayed and mocked. He referred the matter to the Inquisition. Galileo was summoned to Rome in 1633 to stand trial. He was 69 years old and in poor health, but the Inquisition showed no leniency. The trial was a foregone conclusion. Galileo was forced to recant, to declare that he had been wrong to suggest Earth moved around the Sun. On June 22nd, 1633, Galileo knelt before the Inquisition and read a prepared statement. He admitted that he had defended and taught something contrary to Holy Scripture. He declared that he abandoned the false opinion that the Sun was the centre of the universe and Earth moved. He swore that he would never again say or assert anything that might give cause for similar suspicion. Legend claims that after his recantation, Galileo muttered under his breath, "And yet it moves," referring to Earth. This probably never happened, but it became a popular story because it captured the essential absurdity. The Church could force Galileo to deny what his observations clearly showed, but it couldn't change reality. Earth continued orbiting the Sun regardless of what the Inquisition declared. Galileo was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life. He was forbidden from publishing or teaching. The dialogue was banned. Heliocentrism remained officially heretical until 1758, when the Church finally removed Copernican works from its index of forbidden books. It wasn't until 1992, more than 350 years after Galileo's trial, that Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged that the Church had erred in condemning him. The complete records of Galileo's trial were opened to scholars in 1998. They reveal the political and personal factors behind his condemnation. Urban VIII's sense of betrayal, the Inquisition's need to assert authority over scientific inquiry, the Church's fear that accepting heliocentrism would undermine its claim to interpret Scripture authoritatively. These documents show an institution that chose dogma over evidence, authority over truth. The case of Giordano Bruno presents an even darker story. Bruno was a Dominican friar, philosopher and cosmologist who pushed beyond Copernicus to propose that the universe was infinite, that stars were distant suns with their own planets, and that life might exist on those other worlds. He rejected core Catholic doctrines including the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, and transubstantiation. Bruno travelled across Europe, never staying long in one place, always stirring controversy. He was excommunicated by Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists. Everyone found him heretical. In 1591, he was lured to Venice by a nobleman who promised patronage, but instead betrayed him to the Venetian Inquisition. Bruno was arrested and eventually transferred to Rome, where he spent the next 8 years in prison. The Roman Inquisition tried to get Bruno to recant. They wanted him to admit his errors, return to Catholic orthodoxy. Bruno refused. He was stubborn, convinced of his ideas, unwilling to submit. The trial dragged on for years. Finally, in 1600, the Inquisition declared him an impenitent heretic and turned him over to secular authorities for punishment. On February 17th, 1600, they brought Bruno to the Campo de' Fiori in Rome. He was stripped, tied to a stake, and burned alive. According to witnesses, when they showed him a crucifix before lighting the fire, he turned his head away. His ashes were scattered, his works banned, his memory condemned. Bruno's execution had nothing to do with his scientific ideas and everything to do with his theological heresies. The Church didn't kill him for proposing an infinite universe. They killed him for denying the Trinity and other core doctrines. But the timing and method of his death made him a martyr for scientific freedom. His statue now stands in the Campo de' Fiori, on the spot where he was burned, a memorial to a man who refused to recant what he believed to be true. The records of Bruno's trial reveal the Inquisition's methods, the lengthy interrogations, the theological arguments, the attempts to break his will, the final decision that he was too dangerous to live. These documents show how the Church dealt with those who challenged its authority fundamentally and refused to submit. Let's shift to the 16th century and the Protestant Reformation, which fractured European Christianity permanently. Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517 sparked a revolution, but the Vatican's response was slow and inadequate. Pope Leo X initially dismissed Luther as a drunken German who would change his tune when he sobered up. By the time the Vatican took Luther seriously, it was too late. The sale of indulgences triggered Luther's initial protest. The Church had long offered indulgences, spiritual benefits granted in exchange for good works or donations. The theology was complex, involving the treasury of merit earned by Christ and the saints, which the Church could distribute to shorten a soul's time in purgatory. By the 16th century, indulgences had become a fundraising tool. Pope Leo X needed money to complete St. Peter's Basilica, one of the most expensive construction projects in history. He authorized the sale of indulgences throughout Europe. In Germany, a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel sold them aggressively, using tactics that resembled a sales pitch more than spiritual guidance. A popular jingle associated with Tetzel claimed that as soon as a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Luther was appalled. He saw the sale of indulgences as corrupting genuine repentance and faith. His 95 Theses challenged the practice and the theology behind it. He argued that the Pope had no power over purgatory, that true repentance couldn't be bought, that Scripture didn't support the indulgence system. The Vatican's response was to summon Luther to Rome to answer heresy charges. Luther refused, knowing what happened to heretics in Rome. His ruler, Frederick the Wise of Saxony, protected him. A series of debates and negotiations followed, but Luther wouldn't back down. In 1521, Pope Leo X issued a papal bull excommunicating Luther. Luther publicly burned the bull. The Protestant Reformation spread rapidly. Within a decade, much of northern Germany, Scandinavia, England, and parts of Switzerland had broken from Rome. The Catholic Church lost millions of followers, vast territories, enormous wealth, and political influence. The religious unity of Western Christianity was shattered forever. The Vatican archives contain extensive correspondence from this period, letters from papal nuncios reporting on Luther's activities, theological responses to Protestant arguments, political negotiations attempting to stem the tide of defections. These documents reveal how the Vatican struggled to understand and respond to a movement that challenged its fundamental authority. The Church's eventual response came through the Council of Trent, which met intermittently from 1545 to 1563. Trent reaffirmed Catholic doctrine, rejected Protestant theology, and instituted reforms to address some of the corruption that had fed Protestant criticism. But it also hardened divisions. The Council declared Protestant beliefs heretical, making reconciliation impossible. Europe would remain divided between Catholic and Protestant regions, a division that fueled wars for the next century. One of the most brutal episodes of this religious divide was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. In 1572, France was torn by civil war between Catholics and Protestant Huguenots. The young king Charles IX, influenced by his mother Catherine de' Medici, had attempted a policy of religious tolerance. A marriage was arranged between his sister Margaret and Henry of Navarre, a prominent Protestant, to symbolise reconciliation. Thousands of Huguenots gathered in Paris for the wedding in August 1572. The atmosphere was tense. Catholic hardliners saw the assembled Protestants as a threat or an opportunity. On August 24th, the feast day of St. Bartholomew, Catholic mobs began attacking Huguenots in Paris. What started as targeted killings of Protestant leaders turned into widespread massacre. For 3 days, Catholics hunted Protestants through the streets of Paris. Men, women and children were killed. Bodies were thrown into the Seine. Some estimates put the death toll in Paris alone at 2,000 or more. The violence spread to other French cities. Across France, between 5,000 and 30,000 Huguenots were killed in the weeks following the initial massacre. Pope Gregory XIII celebrated the news from France. When he learned of the massacre, he ordered a Te Deum to be sung in thanksgiving. He commissioned a commemorative medal showing an angel with a cross and sword standing over the bodies of slain Huguenots. Frescoes celebrating the event were painted in the Vatican. The massacre was presented as a victory for the faith, a blow struck against heresy. The Protestant world was horrified. The massacre confirmed their worst fears about Catholic intentions. It hardened religious divisions and ensured that the wars of religion would continue. France itself remained torn by conflict until Henry of Navarre, the Protestant groom who survived the massacre, eventually converted to Catholicism to become King Henry IV and bring peace. The Vatican's celebration of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre remains one of its most shameful moments. Documents in the archives include the papal nuncio's reports on events in France and correspondence celebrating the destruction of heretics. These papers reveal an institution that viewed mass violence against religious minorities as cause for celebration, that commissioned art to glorify what most would now consider atrocity. Let's move to the 17th century and examine the 30 Years' War, one of Europe's most devastating conflicts. The war began in 1618 as a religious dispute in Bohemia and eventually engulfed most of Europe, killing millions through violence, famine and disease. The Vatican played a complicated role, sometimes attempting to mediate, sometimes actively fueling the conflict. Pope Urban VIII, who reigned from 1623 to 1644, was more concerned with maintaining the political independence of the Papal States than with religious solidarity. He feared Habsburg domination of Italy more than he feared Protestant success in Germany. This led him to support Catholic France, even though France was allied with Protestant Sweden against the Catholic Habsburgs. The Pope's political calculations outweighed religious considerations. The resulting situation was absurd. Catholic France, funded partly by papal money, fought alongside Protestant Sweden against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. German Catholic princes sometimes found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict. The war that had begun over religion devolved into a political free-for-all where religious labels meant less than strategic advantage. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 ended the war but marked another decline in papal authority. The treaty was negotiated without significant papal involvement. When Pope Innocent X learned of the terms, he issued a bull declaring the religious provisions null and void. Nobody cared. The European powers ignored the papal protest. The treaty stood, and the Pope's irrelevance in international politics was confirmed. The Westphalian settlement established the principle that rulers could determine the religion of their territories. It granted legal recognition to Protestantism alongside Catholicism. It transferred church lands to Protestant control in many areas. The Catholic Church lost territory, influence, and any pretense that it could dictate religious settlement in Europe through papal authority alone. Documents from this period in the Vatican archives reveal the papacy's diminishing influence. Letters from papal diplomats describing their exclusion from negotiations, financial records showing money sent to Catholic armies, theological arguments that nobody outside Rome took seriously anymore. These papers chronicle an institution grappling with its loss of political power, forced to accept a Europe where Catholic universalism was dead. The 17th and 18th centuries brought the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, philosophical and scientific movements that challenged church authority in new ways. the Church responded by doubling down on censorship. The Index of Forbidden Books, which had existed since 1559, grew longer and more comprehensive. The index banned works by authors Catholic and Protestant, scientific and literary, philosophical and theological. Copernicus's heliocentric model was forbidden. Kepler's astronomical works were banned. Descartes' philosophy was prohibited. Works by Pascal, Spinoza, Hobbes, Locke and Hume all made the list. The Church attempted to control what Catholics could read, think and believe. The index wasn't just a list. Possession of banned books could lead to prosecution by the Inquisition. Books were confiscated and burned. Publishers who printed forbidden works risked punishment. The Church tried to maintain ideological control through censorship to prevent dangerous ideas from spreading among the faithful. But books are difficult to suppress. Banned works circulated anyway, often smuggled or printed under false names. The index became a guide to interesting reading rather than an effective tool of censorship. Enlightenment ideas spread throughout Europe despite Catholic efforts to contain them. The Church's attempt to control information failed, but the index remained in effect until 1966, a monument to institutional resistance to intellectual freedom. The Vatican archives contain the records of the index's operations, which books were banned and why, theological evaluations of controversial works, reports on illegal publishing. These documents reveal an institution deeply threatened by the spread of ideas it couldn't control, fighting a losing battle against the intellectual currents of modernity. The French Revolution and its aftermath dealt another devastating blow to church power and prestige. In 1789, the revolutionary government of France confiscated church property, dissolved monasteries, and subordinated the church to state control through the civil constitution of the clergy. Priests were required to swear loyalty to the revolutionary government. Many refused and were persecuted. During the Reign of Terror, the revolutionaries attempted to eradicate Christianity entirely. Churches were closed or converted to temples of reason. Christian festivals were replaced with revolutionary holidays. Priests were imprisoned or executed. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was rededicated to the cult of reason. The dechristianization campaign failed to destroy French Catholicism, but it traumatized the Church and confirmed its worst fears about secular government. Napoleon Bonaparte ended the chaos, but on his own terms. He negotiated a concordat with Pope Pius VII in 1801 that restored the Church's position in France but under state control. The Church regained the right to function publicly, but Napoleon appointed bishops and controlled church property. In 1804, Napoleon invited Pius VII to Paris to crown him emperor, but at the ceremony, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and crowned himself, making clear who was really in charge. Relations between Napoleon and the papacy deteriorated. In 1809, Napoleon annexed the Papal States, stripping the Pope of his temporal power. Pius VII excommunicated Napoleon in response. Napoleon had the Pope arrested and held prisoner in France for 5 years. The Emperor of France had kidnapped the Pope, and Europe's Catholic powers could do nothing about it. Napoleon's fall in 1815 allowed Pius VII to return to Rome and reclaim the Papal States. But the world had changed. The Revolution had demonstrated that church power could be overthrown, that sacred institutions weren't immune to political upheaval. The 19th century would bring more challenges as nationalism, liberalism and secularism spread across Europe. The Papal States themselves became increasingly untenable. Italian nationalism grew throughout the 19th century, with many Italians demanding unification of the peninsula under a single government. The Papal States, a band of territory cutting across central Italy, stood in the way of unification. Italian nationalists viewed the Pope's temporal power as an obstacle to progress. In 1848, revolutions swept Europe. In Rome, revolutionaries established a republic and forced Pope Pius IX to flee. The Pope was only able to return with the help of French troops, who occupied Rome to maintain papal authority. The situation was humiliating. The Pope required foreign bayonets to hold his own capital. The process of Italian unification continued through the 1850s and 1860s. Most of the Papal States were annexed to the new Kingdom of Italy. By 1870, only Rome itself remained under papal control, and that only because French troops protected it. When France withdrew its garrison during the Franco-Prussian War, Italian forces immediately marched on Rome. On September 20th, 1870, Italian artillery breached the walls. After a brief fight, the Pope ordered his forces to surrender to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. The Papal States ceased to exist. Pope Pius IX retreated to the Vatican and declared himself a prisoner. He refused to recognise the Italian government, excommunicated the Italian king, and forbade Catholics from participating in Italian politics. This self-imposed captivity lasted until 1929, through the reigns of 8 popes, none of whom set foot outside the Vatican. The archives contain extensive documentation of these events, diplomatic correspondence attempting to maintain papal independence, financial records as the Papal States' revenues dried up, theological justifications for the Pope's temporal power, internal debates about how to respond to nationalism and modernity. These documents reveal an institution in crisis, watching its political power evaporate, struggling to adapt to a world where spiritual authority was no longer backed by territorial sovereignty. The loss of the Papal States forced the Church to redefine itself. Without temporal power, the papacy had to rely on spiritual and moral authority alone. This eventually strengthened the Church in some ways, allowing it to position itself above worldly politics. But in the short term, it felt like catastrophe. Pope Pius IX responded to the modern world's challenges by rejecting them. In 1864, he issued the Syllabus of Errors, a list of 80 propositions that Catholics were required to reject. The syllabus condemned progress, liberalism, modern civilization, religious freedom, separation of church and state, and secular government. The final proposition stated it was an error to believe that the Pope can and ought to reconcile himself to progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. This syllabus shocked even many Catholics. It seemed to place the Church in absolute opposition to the modern world. Liberal Catholics tried to interpret it charitably, but the meaning was clear. The Church rejected accommodation with modernity. This hard line would persist well into the 20th century. In 1870, the First Vatican Council proclaimed the doctrine of papal infallibility. When the Pope speaks ex cathedra on matters of faith and morals, the Council declared, he cannot err. His pronouncements are infallible, protected from error by the Holy Spirit. This was a maximalist assertion of papal authority at precisely the moment when papal temporal power had collapsed. The timing wasn't coincidental. The doctrine of infallibility was partly a response to the loss of political power. If the Pope could no longer enforce his will through armies and territory, his spiritual authority needed to be absolute and unchallengeable. Infallibility elevated the Pope above criticism on theological matters, making him the final arbiter of Catholic doctrine. Not all Catholics accepted this. A schism resulted, with some Catholics breaking away to form old Catholic churches that rejected infallibility. But the vast majority accepted the new doctrine, and it became central to Catholic identity. The Pope wasn't just the Church's administrative head. His teaching authority was, under certain conditions, protected from error by God himself. The late 19th and early 20th centuries forced the Church to confront scientific findings that challenged traditional interpretations of Genesis. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, published in 1859, contradicted literal readings of the Bible's creation account. The Church's initial response was largely hostile, seeing evolution as materialistic and atheistic. Pope Pius X, who reigned from 1903 to 1914, fought a campaign against modernism, which he defined as the synthesis of all heresies. Modernism wasn't a single movement, but rather a label applied to various attempts to reconcile Catholic theology with modern biblical scholarship, scientific discoveries, and philosophical developments. Pius X saw these efforts as dangerous compromises that undermined faith. In 1907, he issued the decree Lamentabili Sane Exitu and the encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis, which condemned modernist positions and required all clergy to swear an anti-modernist oath. Priests and theologians suspected of modernist sympathies were investigated, silenced, or removed from their positions. The campaign created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear within Catholic intellectual circles. Scholars learned to self-censor, to avoid topics that might attract accusations of modernism. The anti-modernist campaign damaged Catholic scholarship for decades. Talented theologians were silenced or driven out. Biblical studies languished while Protestant and secular scholars advanced the field. The Church's intellectual life stagnated under the weight of censorship and suspicion. It wasn't until the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s that this stranglehold began to loosen. Documents related to the anti-modernist campaign fill the archives, reports on suspected modernists, lists of books to be censored, correspondence about theologians under investigation. These papers reveal an institution so threatened by modern thought that it chose to retreat into dogmatic rigidity rather than engage with new ideas. But we need to discuss what might be the darkest period in the Vatican's modern history, its conduct during World War II and the Holocaust. Pope Pius XII, who reigned from 1939 to 1958, has been at the centre of controversy for decades over the question of what he knew about the Holocaust and what he did or failed to do in response. Eugenio Pacelli, who became Pius XII, served as papal nuncio to Germany from 1917 to 1929. He knew Germany well, spoke fluent German, and had negotiated concordats with several German states. In 1933, as Vatican Secretary of State, he negotiated a concordat with Hitler's new government. The concordat guaranteed the Church's rights in Germany in exchange for the Church withdrawing from German politics and dissolving the Catholic Centre Party. The 1933 concordat remains controversial. Critics argue it legitimised the Nazi regime at a crucial moment, helping Hitler consolidate power. Defenders claim the Church was simply trying to protect its interests, and had no way of knowing what Hitler would become. What's undeniable is that the Concordat ended organised Catholic political opposition to Nazism in Germany. When Pacelli became Pius XII in 1939, Europe was on the brink of war. He maintained strict neutrality, refusing to condemn Nazi Germany by name, even as evidence of atrocities accumulated. In 1942, information about the systematic destruction of European Jews began reaching the Vatican. Papal diplomats sent reports. Jewish organisations pleaded for papal intervention. Allied governments urged the Pope to speak out. Pius XII made general statements condemning atrocities against innocent people, without naming Germans or Jews specifically. In his 1942 Christmas message, he referred to the hundreds of thousands who, without any fault of their own, sometimes only by reason of their nationality or race, are marked down for death or progressive extinction. This was as close as he came to acknowledging the Holocaust publicly during the war. Why didn't Pius XII speak more clearly? Defenders offer several reasons. He feared that explicit condemnation would make things worse for Catholics in occupied territories. He worried about communist expansion into Europe and saw Germany as a bulwark against Soviet atheism. He believed quiet diplomacy could save more lives than public pronouncements. He thought maintaining Vatican neutrality was essential for the Church's role as a moral authority above the conflict. Critics respond that these explanations are inadequate. When Nazis invaded Holland, Dutch bishops spoke out forcefully, and the Germans deported more Jews in retaliation. But the bishops had spoken. They had borne witness. Pius XII chose not to, and 6 million Jews died while the Pope remained largely silent. No fear of reprisals, no strategic calculation, no diplomatic consideration can fully justify that silence. The question of what Pius XII personally did to help Jews is complicated. There's evidence that he approved covert operations to hide Jews in Catholic institutions in Rome. Convents, monasteries and churches across Italy sheltered Jews during the German occupation. Some of this happened with Vatican knowledge and approval, but it was hidden, never publicly acknowledged, and limited in scope. In October 1943, Germans rounded up over 1,000 Jews from Rome's ghetto, literally within sight of the Vatican. They were held for 2 days before being deported to Auschwitz. Pius XII did not publicly protest. He did not threaten excommunication. He did not even explicitly demand their release. Of the 1,000 deported, only 16 survived. After the war, Pius XII and the Vatican were widely praised by Jewish organisations for their help during the Holocaust. But this assessment began to change in the 1960s, particularly after the publication of Rolf Hochhuth's play The Deputy, which portrayed Pius XII as indifferent to Jewish suffering. The play sparked a controversy that has never been fully resolved. The Vatican secret archives contain extensive documentation from the war years. Pius XII's papers, diplomatic reports, information the Vatican received about the Holocaust. For decades, these documents remained closed, fueling speculation about what they might contain. In 2020, the Vatican finally opened Pius XII's archives to scholars. Researchers are still working through millions of documents, but some findings have emerged. The archives confirm that the Vatican received detailed information about the Holocaust from multiple sources throughout the war. Reports described concentration camps, mass shootings, gas chambers. The Vatican knew what was happening. The archives also show that Pius XII was deeply concerned about the Soviet threat and viewed communism as an existential danger to the Church, possibly explaining his reluctance to fully oppose Germany. What's still debated is whether releasing more documents would have changed anything. Would a forceful papal condemnation of the Holocaust have saved lives? Would it have spurred Catholic resistance to Nazi policies? Or would it have resulted in retaliation that made things worse? We can't know what might have happened. We only know what did happen. The Pope remained largely silent while millions were murdered. The Vatican's relationship with fascism extended beyond Germany. In Italy, Pope Pius XI signed the Lateran Treaty with Benito Mussolini in 1929, finally resolving the conflict between the papacy and the Italian state that had existed since 1870. The treaty created Vatican City as an independent state, gave the Church financial compensation for lost territories, and made Catholicism Italy's official religion. Mussolini gained legitimacy from papal recognition. The Church regained independence and financial security. It was a pragmatic deal, but it meant the Vatican accommodated itself to a fascist dictatorship. Pius XI eventually grew critical of fascism, particularly after Mussolini allied with Hitler and adopted anti-Jewish laws. In 1937, Pius XI issued the encyclical Mitbrennender Sorg, which criticised Nazi ideology, though it focused on violations of the Concordat rather than the regime's fundamental evil. Pius XI also commissioned a stronger encyclical condemning racism and anti-Jewish persecution to be called Humani Generis Unitas. He assigned 3 Jesuits to draft it. They produced a text that condemned racism, defended the Jewish people's right to existence, and criticised anti-Jewish persecution, but Pius XI died in February 1939 before the encyclical could be issued. His successor, Pius XII, buried the text. It was never published. The encyclical that might have clearly condemned Nazi racial ideology before the war remained hidden until historians discovered it in the archives decades later. Why did Pius XII suppress Humani Generis Unitas? The reasons remain debated. Perhaps he thought it would inflame tensions with Germany just as war was beginning. Perhaps he disagreed with its contents. Perhaps he believed quiet diplomacy was more effective. Whatever his reasons, the decision meant the Catholic Church never issued a clear, authoritative condemnation of racist ideology during the crucial years when such a statement might have mattered most. After World War II, the Vatican became involved in another controversy, helping Nazi war criminals escape justice. The so-called rat lines were networks that helped fugitives flee Europe to South America and other destinations. Some of these networks operated through Catholic institutions and involved Catholic clergy. The most notorious figure was Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome. Hudal was a Nazi sympathizer who believed anti-communism justified cooperation with former Nazis. He helped numerous war criminals obtain false papers and passage to Argentina, Brazil, and other countries. Among those he assisted was Franz Stangl, commandant of Treblinka, where 900,000 Jews were murdered. Another key figure was Father Krunoslav Draganovic, a Croatian priest who ran a rat line helping Croatian fascist war criminals escape. The Ustaše regime in Croatia had murdered hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma with extraordinary brutality. After the war, Draganovic helped Ustaše leaders flee to South America, providing them with false documents and arranging their passage. The extent of Vatican knowledge and approval of these rat lines remains disputed. Hudal and Draganovic acted independently in many ways, but they used church resources, operated from church properties, and were never officially censured. Lower-level church officials must have known what was happening. Whether the highest levels of the Vatican knew and approved is less clear, though it seems unlikely such operations could have continued without at least tacit, high-level awareness. The Vatican has never fully accounted for its role in the rat lines. Documents related to these operations remain among the most sensitive in the archives. Researchers have found some evidence, but much remains classified or inaccessible. The full story of the Vatican's involvement in helping war criminals escape justice may never be completely known. The post-war period brought the Cold War, and the Vatican positioned itself firmly on the anti-communist side. Pope Pius XII excommunicated all communists in 1949, declaring that Catholics who professed communist ideology were automatically excommunicated. This was partly ideological opposition to atheistic communism and partly a political response to communist persecution of the Church in Eastern Europe and China. The Vatican cooperated with Western intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, in anti-communist activities. Church networks provided intelligence from behind the Iron Curtain. Catholic organisations received covert funding to oppose communist parties in Italy and other countries. The Church saw communism as an existential threat and acted accordingly. This anti-communist stance led to problematic alliances. In Latin America, the Church often supported right-wing military dictatorships because they opposed communism, even as these regimes engaged in torture, disappearances, and murder. The Church's anti-communist priorities sometimes outweighed its commitment to human rights and social justice. Argentina provides a particularly troubling example. During the military dictatorship from 1976 to 1983, security forces kidnapped, tortured, and killed thousands of people in the dirty war. Some Catholic clergy supported the regime, blessed the military, and remained silent about atrocities. A few bishops spoke out, but the church hierarchy largely acquiesced. One of the junta's leaders, Jorge Videla, was a practicing Catholic who attended Mass regularly, even as his government disappeared tens of thousands of people. The church never excommunicated him. When relatives of the disappeared protested, demanding to know what happened to their loved ones, they often found church doors closed to them. The church's relationship with Argentina's dictatorship remains a source of shame, particularly painful because Argentina is Pope Francis's homeland. The Second Vatican Council, held from 1962 to 1965, attempted to modernize the church and open it to dialogue with the contemporary world. Pope John XXIII called the council, famously saying he wanted to open the church's windows and let in fresh air. The council produced significant reforms. The Mass was translated into local languages instead of remaining in Latin. The church officially rejected anti-Jewish theology that had blamed Jews collectively for Christ's death. Ecumenical dialogue with other Christian denominations was encouraged. Religious freedom was affirmed. Vatican II was revolutionary for the Catholic Church, but it also created divisions that persist today. Progressive Catholics thought the reforms didn't go far enough and wanted further changes, particularly regarding women's roles and church authority. Conservative Catholics thought the reforms went too far and damaged the Church's traditional identity. These tensions have shaped Catholic debates for the past 60 years. One area where Vatican II changed little was clerical celibacy. The requirement that priests remain unmarried and celibate has been church law since the 12th century. It's often presented as ancient and unchangeable, but it's actually a medieval disciplinary rule, not a matter of doctrine. The early church allowed married clergy. Several apostles, including Peter, were married. Eastern Catholic churches in communion with Rome allow married priests. The celibacy requirement was imposed for practical and theological reasons. Practically, it prevented church property from being inherited by priests' children. Theologically, celibacy was seen as a higher spiritual state, allowing priests to devote themselves completely to God. Over centuries, mandatory celibacy became so entrenched in Catholic identity that questioning it became almost heretical. But mandatory celibacy has created serious problems. It limits the pool of potential priests contributing to priest shortages. It may attract men with psychological or sexual issues who see celibacy as a solution rather than a calling. And it creates an environment where sexual misconduct, when it occurs, is more likely to be hidden because acknowledging it threatens the entire system. This brings us to perhaps the greatest crisis facing the modern Catholic Church, the clerical abuse scandal. For decades, priests across the world violated children and vulnerable adults, and church authorities systematically covered up these crimes, moving predatory priests from parish to parish rather than reporting them to police. The full scope of the abuse crisis is staggering. Thousands of priests across dozens of countries abused tens of thousands of victims. The pattern was remarkably consistent. A priest would abuse someone, usually a child. Victims or their families would report it to church authorities. Instead of contacting police, bishops would quietly reassign the priest to another parish, often without warning the new community. The priest would offend again. The pattern would repeat. This wasn't just negligence. It was a systematic policy of protecting the institution's reputation at the expense of children's safety. The church valued avoiding scandal over preventing abuse. Documents show that bishops knew priests were dangerous but moved them anyway. Insurance companies warned the church about liability risks from known predators, but bishops continued reassigning them. The scandal went public in 2002 when the Boston Globe published an investigation revealing how Cardinal Bernard Law had transferred known abusers between parishes for years. The story sparked investigations worldwide. Country after country revealed similar patterns: Australia, Ireland, Germany, Chile, Poland. Everywhere investigators looked, they found abuse and cover-up. The Vatican's response was slow and defensive. For years, church officials minimized the problem, blamed media anti-Catholic bias, or suggested the issue was exaggerated. When Pope Benedict XVI finally addressed it directly, he focused on the crimes of individual priests rather than the institutional failures that enabled them. It wasn't until Pope Francis that the Church began to acknowledge the systemic nature of the problem and implement meaningful reforms. But even under Francis, progress has been uneven. He established a commission to address abuse, but some members resigned in frustration over lack of action. He promised zero tolerance, but has been inconsistent in applying it. High-ranking bishops credibly accused of covering up abuse have faced few consequences. Victims' advocates argue that real change remains superficial, that the Church still prioritizes its reputation over justice for survivors. The archives contain documents related to abuse cases, though many remain sealed. What has been released shows that the Vatican knew about widespread abuse for decades. Reports from around the world detailed the problem. Psychologists warned that reassigning offenders was dangerous. Canon lawyers outlined the Church's legal obligations. All of this was known at the highest levels, yet the cover-up continued. One particularly damaging document is the 1962 instruction Crimen Solicitationis, which outlined procedures for handling accusations that priests sexually solicited penitents during confession. The document required absolute secrecy, warning that anyone who violated confidentiality would be excommunicated, while the instruction dealt specifically with solicitation during confession, not general abuse. Its emphasis on secrecy reflected the Church's broader approach: handle everything internally, never involve civil authorities, protect the Church's reputation above all. The financial cost of the abuse crisis has been enormous. The Church has paid billions in settlements to survivors. Entire dioceses have declared bankruptcy to manage lawsuit liabilities. Properties have been sold, programs cut, institutions closed. But the moral and spiritual cost is incalculable. Millions have left the Church, unable to maintain faith in an institution that betrayed children so profoundly. The Church's moral authority, its claim to speak on ethical matters, has been permanently damaged. Beyond the abuse crisis itself, the scandal revealed how the Church's hierarchical structure, its culture of secrecy, its clericalism, and its treatment of sexuality all contributed to creating an environment where abuse could flourish and be hidden. Real reform would require addressing these deeper issues, but that would mean fundamentally rethinking how the Church operates. Whether that's possible remains an open question. Let's examine the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion. Founded in 1942, the bank was intended to manage the Vatican's finances and support Catholic charitable works. Instead, it became associated with scandal, money laundering, and ties to organized crime. The most infamous episode involved Roberto Calvi and the Banco Ambrosiano collapse. Calvi was chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, which had close ties to the Vatican Bank. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Ambrosiano was used to move money illegally, including laundering funds for the Italian mafia and secretly financing Solidarity in Poland at the CIA's request. The Vatican Bank was deeply involved in these operations. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed in 1982 with $1.4 billion in debts, it created an international financial scandal. Calvi fled to London. On June 18, 1982, his body was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge. Initially ruled a death by one's own hand, the circumstances were suspicious. Calvi's pockets were filled with bricks and cash. He had ties to Italian organised crime, to illegal financial operations and to the Vatican Bank. Later investigations concluded Calvi was murdered, likely by the mafia. The Vatican Bank's role in Banco Ambrosiano's collapse remained murky. The Vatican eventually paid $250 million to creditors without admitting wrongdoing, calling it a gesture of goodwill. But the scandal tainted the Vatican Bank's reputation permanently. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, who headed the Vatican Bank from 1971 to 1989, was at the centre of these controversies. Italian prosecutors sought to indict him for fraud related to Banco Ambrosiano, but he was protected by Vatican diplomatic immunity. He remained in Vatican City until the statute of limitations expired, then retired to Arizona, never facing trial. The Vatican Bank continued to face problems. In 2010, Italian authorities seized $30 million from Vatican Bank accounts, investigating money laundering allegations. European financial authorities repeatedly criticised the Vatican for insufficient financial controls. The bank was widely believed to be used for tax evasion by wealthy Italians and possibly for more serious crimes. Pope Francis has attempted to reform the Vatican Bank, installing new leadership and implementing stricter controls. Some progress has been made, but the institution's history of scandal makes it difficult to restore trust. The archives contain financial records, though the most sensitive documents about the bank's operations remain inaccessible to outside researchers. Another modern controversy involves the Vatican's stance on sexuality, particularly homosexuality and contraception. In 1968, Pope Paul VI issued the encyclical Humanae Vitae, which reaffirmed the Church's prohibition on artificial contraception. The encyclical was deeply controversial, coming at a time when most married Catholics were already using birth control. Many Catholics expected the Church to change its teaching to acknowledge the reality of modern life and the needs of married couples. Instead, Paul VI doubled down on traditional doctrine. The encyclical created a crisis of authority. Catholic theologians criticised it. National bishops' conferences issued qualified statements suggesting Catholics should follow their own consciences. Polls showed that most Catholics ignored the teaching. The gap between official church doctrine and the lived reality of Catholics' lives became undeniable. Humanae Vitae's reasoning was partly based on natural law philosophy, arguing that contraception violated the natural purpose of intercourse. But it was also motivated by fear that changing teaching on contraception would undermine the Church's authority. If the Church could be wrong about this, what else might it be wrong about? The concern was that admitting error on contraception would create a cascade of doctrinal challenges. The result was a teaching that most Catholics don't follow, but that the Church refuses to change, creating cognitive dissonance at the heart of Catholic life. Priests in confession largely stopped asking about contraception. Bishops tacitly allowed Catholics to use their judgment, but the official teaching remained, preventing any honest institutional conversation about sexuality and marriage. The Church's teaching on homosexuality has been equally contentious. Official Catholic doctrine describes homosexual acts as intrinsically disordered, and calls homosexual orientation an objective disorder. Gay people are called to lifelong celibacy. The Church opposes same-gender marriage, adoption by same-gender couples, and anti-discrimination laws that would protect gay people in housing and employment. This teaching has caused immense suffering, particularly to gay Catholics who grew up believing their sexual orientation made them disordered, sinful, and unacceptable to God. Many left the Church. Others remained but lived in psychological and spiritual anguish, trying to reconcile their identity with Church teaching. Some entered priesthood hoping celibacy would resolve their internal conflict, contributing to the high number of gay priests despite the Church's official condemnation of homosexuality. Pope Francis has made gestures toward a more pastoral approach, famously asking, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about gay priests. But he hasn't changed Church teaching. He's maintained opposition to same-gender marriage and described gender theory as ideological colonization. The modest opening he created has been walked back by more conservative bishops, and structural change remains elusive. The Church's sexual teachings have become increasingly out of step with modern society. In much of the developed world, same-gender marriage is legal and widely accepted. Contraception is nearly universal. The Church's positions isolate it from mainstream culture, making it difficult to evangelize effectively. Yet changing these teachings would require the Church to admit it was wrong, something the doctrine of infallibility makes very difficult. These tensions come together in the question of women's roles in the Church. Women cannot be ordained as priests, cannot preach at Mass, cannot make decisions at the highest levels of church governance. The all-male clergy and hierarchy means the Church's teachings on sexuality, marriage, and family life are determined entirely by celibate men. The prohibition on women's ordination is presented as unchangeable, rooted in Christ's choice of male apostles. But this reasoning is historically questionable. Early Christianity included women in leadership roles. Women were deacons, possibly even priests in some communities. The exclusion of women from ordained ministry developed over centuries and was influenced more by cultural misogyny than by divine mandate. Pope John Paul II declared in 1994 that the Church has no authority to ordain women, attempting to end debate on the question. But this hasn't prevented many Catholics from continuing to push for change. Polls consistently show majority support for women's ordination among Catholics in the developed world. The issue isn't going away, and the Church's refusal to even discuss it seriously contributes to the exodus of women from active participation in church life. The Vatican archives contain centuries of documents reflecting the Church's views on women, theological treatises explaining women's supposed inferiority, canon law restricting women's participation, correspondence about religious orders of women and how to control them. These documents trace a history of systematic exclusion, of an institution that claimed half of humanity was created by God yet denied that half any real authority or voice within the Church. As we move into the 21st century, the Catholic Church faces an existential crisis, particularly in Europe and North America where it was once dominant. Church attendance has collapsed, seminaries are closing, parishes are merging or shutting down. In Ireland, which was 95% Catholic within living memory, the Church has imploded following the abuse scandal and revelations about Magdalene laundries and mother and baby homes where thousands of women and children suffered and died. The collapse is most dramatic in traditionally Catholic countries. Spain, Italy, Ireland, Poland and Quebec have all seen mass defections. The Church retains strength in parts of Africa and Asia, but even there, growth is slowing. The demographics are brutal. The average Catholic is old and getting older. Young people are leaving and not coming back. The Church attributes this to secularization, to relativism, to the loss of faith in the modern world. But this explanation ignores the Church's own failures: the abuse crisis, the cover-ups, the exclusion of women, the condemnation of gay people, the refusal to engage honestly with sexuality, the disconnect between teaching and lived reality. These aren't external problems imposed on the Church. They're internal failures of leadership, judgment, and moral courage. Pope Francis represents an attempt to address some of these issues. He's emphasized mercy over judgment, decentralized some authority, and tried to focus the Church on poverty and social justice, rather than culture war issues. But he's also maintained traditional teachings on sexuality and women's ordination. He's been inconsistent on accountability for abuse, and he's faced fierce resistance from conservative bishops and cardinals who want to reverse even his modest reforms. The question facing the Church is whether meaningful change is possible within its current structure. Can an institution that claims infallibility admit it was wrong? Can a hierarchy that derives its authority from tradition embrace fundamental reform? Can a Church governed entirely by celibate men honestly address sexuality, marriage, and women's roles? These aren't easy questions, and there's no guarantee the Church will survive in its current form if it can't answer them. Throughout this journey through 8 centuries, we've seen patterns repeat. The Church accumulating political power, then losing it. Claims of absolute authority colliding with reality. Ideological rigidity leading to violence and persecution. Reform movements crushed, only to resurface in new forms. Secrecy and cover-up creating worse scandals than transparency would have. An institution that speaks of eternal truths, forced to navigate temporal politics. The Vatican secret archives, now the Apostolic archives, contain all of this history. The triumphs and the atrocities, the moments of genuine holiness and the depths of corruption, the sincere faith of billions and the calculated cynicism of those who wielded religious authority for worldly ends. These documents don't tell a simple story of good versus evil. They reveal something more complicated. An institution made up of humans with all the nobility and depravity that implies. Some documents in the archives remain sealed, some are accessible only with special permission. Others have been destroyed, either deliberately or through accident and neglect. We'll never know the full story. But what we do know is enough to see that the Vatican's history is neither as glorious as its defenders claim, nor as purely evil as its critics suggest. It's human history, made by humans, full of the contradictions and moral complexities that mark all human institutions. The archives will continue to yield secrets as more documents become available. Researchers will discover new controversies, find evidence of events we didn't know about, reinterpret periods we thought we understood. The process of historical discovery continues. The Vatican guards its secrets carefully, but time is a patient revealer of truth. Eventually, most of what's hidden becomes known. As we close this exploration, consider what these 8 centuries teach us. Power corrupts, especially when claimed in God's name. Secrecy breeds abuse. Authority without accountability enables evil. Good intentions don't excuse bad actions. And institutions, no matter how old or revered, are only as moral as the people who run them and the structures that govern them. The Vatican sits at the heart of Rome, a tiny city-state containing centuries of accumulated history. Tourists visit to see the art, the architecture, the spectacle. But beneath the beauty lies this other history, preserved in documents and hidden in archives. It's a history worth knowing, not to attack faith or mock believers, but to understand how religious authority has functioned in the world, how it's been used and abused, how it's shaped the lives of billions. The Church will continue. It survived worse crises than the current ones, but it will only thrive if it can learn from its history, can acknowledge its failures, can reform its structures, can become what it claims to be, a moral voice grounded in truth and justice rather than power and self-protection. The 53 miles of shelving hold more than documents. They hold evidence of humanity's capacity for both transcendence and depravity, often existing side by side, sometimes in the same person, the same institution, the same moment. That paradox is what makes this history fascinating and frustrating, inspiring and infuriating, ultimately very human. If you've stayed with this journey through 8 centuries, thank you. These stories matter. They're part of how we got here, how the world became what it is. They're reminders that nothing is inevitable, that institutions change, that power shifts, that what seems permanent eventually passes. They're lessons about authority and accountability, about the difference between genuine moral leadership and the mere assertion of power. And if you found this exploration worthwhile, if these stories resonated with you or taught you something you didn't know, consider subscribing. There are more histories to explore, more secrets to uncover, more stories that deserve to be told. Leave a comment about which part of this history surprised you most, or what you'd like to explore next. And wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is there, I'm grateful you spent this time here, learning about the complicated past that shapes our present. But before we finish, there are more layers to this history that deserve attention. The Vatican's influence extended far beyond Europe, reaching into every corner of the globe through missionary activity, colonization, and the exercise of spiritual authority over 1 billion Catholics worldwide. These global dimensions reveal additional complexities, additional secrets, additional moral questions that the archives preserve. The Spanish conquest of the Americas provides one of the most troubling chapters. When Christopher Columbus reached the Caribbean in 1492, he carried letters from the Spanish monarchs to potential Asian rulers. He never found those rulers, but he did find populated islands. The indigenous Taino people greeted him peacefully. Within a generation they were nearly extinct, destroyed by disease, forced labour, and violence. The Spanish conquest proceeded with papal blessing. Pope Alexander VI's bulls dividing the world between Spain and Portugal gave explicit approval for European colonization. The bulls spoke of bringing Christian faith to barbarous nations, of converting pagans to the true religion. They treated entire civilizations as resources to be allocated between Christian monarchs. The theological justification for conquest involved the concept of just war. Spanish jurists and theologians debated whether indigenous peoples had rights to their land and whether conquest could be legitimate. The Valladolid debate of 1550 featured arguments between Bartolomé de las Casas, who defended indigenous rights, and Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, who argued that indigenous peoples were natural slaves who benefited from Spanish rule. Las Casas had first-hand experience of Spanish brutality in the Americas. He had participated in conquest before experiencing a conversion and becoming a Dominican friar dedicated to indigenous rights. His writings documented atrocities in graphic detail. Spanish soldiers burning villages, mass killings, forced labour in mines and plantations that worked people to death, the destruction of indigenous cultures and religions. Las Casas estimated that Spanish colonization killed millions of indigenous people. Modern historians debate the numbers, but there's no question that the conquest was catastrophic. Entire civilizations disappeared. The Aztec Empire, with its sophisticated cities and complex society, was destroyed. The Inca Empire similarly fell. Countless smaller societies were obliterated completely. The Catholic Church was deeply implicated. Missionaries accompanied conquistadors, providing spiritual justification for conquest. The requirement that indigenous peoples be offered the requerimiento, a document demanding they accept Spanish authority and Catholic faith or face war, was a legal fiction that satisfied Spanish consciences without protecting indigenous rights. The document was often read in Spanish to people who couldn't understand it, sometimes read to empty forests before attacking villages. Some Catholic clergy genuinely tried to protect indigenous peoples. Las Casas fought for decades against colonial abuses. Other missionaries documented indigenous languages and cultures, even as they worked to destroy indigenous religions. But the institutional church supported colonization, benefited from it financially, and provided theological cover for it. The encomienda system granted Spanish colonists control over indigenous labour. Supposedly, the encomenderos were responsible for Christianizing the indigenous people assigned to them. In practice, the system was forced labour barely distinguishable from slavery. Indigenous people were worked to death in mines and fields. The church received its share of encomienda revenues and rarely challenged the system fundamentally. Documents in the Vatican archives include correspondence between popes and Spanish monarchs about colonization, theological justifications for conquest, reports from missionaries about conditions in the Americas. These papers reveal an institution that saw non-Christian civilizations as legitimate targets for conquest and conversion, that valued spreading the faith more than protecting the lives and rights of non-Christians. The Church's missionary activity continued through subsequent centuries, spreading Catholicism worldwide but often at tremendous cost to indigenous cultures. In Africa, Asia and Oceania, missionaries worked to convert populations, typically viewing local religions as demonic and local cultures as backward. The goal wasn't just religious conversion but cultural transformation, turning indigenous peoples into Europeans in thought and behaviour. In China, this approach led to the Chinese rites controversy. Jesuit missionaries in the 17th and 18th centuries had adopted an accommodating approach, allowing Chinese converts to continue ancestral rites and Confucian practices. The Jesuits argued these were cultural rather than religious practices compatible with Christianity. Other missionary orders disagreed, viewing ancestral rites as idolatrous. The controversy reached Rome. Various popes issued contradictory rulings. Pope Clement XI finally prohibited Chinese Christians from participating in ancestral rites in 1715. The Chinese Emperor Kangxi, who had tolerated Christianity, was furious at this interference in Chinese culture. He banned Christian missionary activity. Christianity in China, which had been growing, was suppressed. The controversy's resolution destroyed the Chinese mission for over a century. The archives contain extensive documentation of the Chinese rites controversy, reports from different missionary orders, theological arguments, papal decisions. These documents reveal the Church's inability to distinguish between essential Christian doctrine and European cultural practices, its insistence that becoming Christian meant abandoning one's own culture for European ways. Similar patterns played out worldwide. In India, the caste system created enormous challenges. The Church initially accommodated caste distinctions, allowing separate churches for different castes, even separate communion. This practical compromise with Indian culture contradicted Christian teaching on human equality. Eventually, Rome prohibited caste-based discrimination in church, but enforcement was inconsistent and the issue remained contentious. In Africa, missionaries frequently aligned with colonial powers. The Belgian Congo provides a particularly horrific example. King Leopold II of Belgium established personal control over the Congo Free State in 1885, claiming humanitarian and missionary motives. What followed was one of history's greatest atrocities. Leopold's regime enslaved the Congolese population, forcing them to collect rubber through a system of terror. Villages that failed to meet quotas faced having their people mutilated or killed. Estimates suggest millions died during Leopold's rule. Catholic missionaries operated in the Congo throughout this period. Some reported abuses to Rome, others collaborated with the colonial regime, accepting its patronage and defending its actions. The institutional church was slow to condemn Leopold's atrocities, reluctant to challenge a Catholic monarch who supported missionary activity. Pope Leo XIII eventually issued an encyclical condemning slavery in 1888, but it was vague and didn't specifically address the Congo. By the time international pressure forced Leopold to transfer the Congo to Belgian state control in 1908, millions had died. The Church had witnessed one of the modern era's greatest crimes, and largely remained silent. Documents from this period show that the Vatican received reports about conditions in the Congo. Missionaries described the atrocities they witnessed, but the Church's response was muted, its priority remaining the maintenance of missionary access and good relations with European powers. The relationship between the Church and colonialism was complex. Missionaries genuinely believed they were saving souls, bringing truth to people living in darkness. They built schools and hospitals, provided services that colonial governments often neglected, but they also served colonial interests, helped pacify colonized populations, undermined indigenous cultures, and provided moral legitimacy for conquest and exploitation. The archives contain mission reports from around the world, letters from missionaries describing their work, theological discussions about how to approach non-Christian cultures. These documents reveal an institution that viewed European Christianity as superior to all other cultures and religions, that believed spreading the faith justified almost any cost to indigenous peoples. Another dimension of Vatican history involves its accumulation of wealth and art. The Church is one of the world's greatest collectors, owning priceless artifacts, manuscripts, paintings, and sculptures. The Vatican museums contain treasures that nations would fight wars to possess. How were these treasures acquired? Not always through legitimate means. Much of the art was commissioned by popes, purchased legally, or donated by wealthy patrons, but some pieces have questionable provenance. During Europe's religious wars, Catholic and Protestant forces both looted churches and monasteries. Artworks flowed to Rome from conquered territories. Napoleon looted extensively during his Italian campaigns, but after his defeat, much of what he'd taken was returned to the Vatican. The Church's wealth extends beyond art. The Vatican Bank manages billions in assets. The Church owns property worldwide. Dioceses control enormous real estate holdings. The full extent of church wealth is difficult to calculate because much is held by separate entities, dioceses, religious orders, and Vatican departments that don't report to a central authority. This wealth creates awkward contrasts. The Church preaches poverty while sitting on treasures. It asks for donations from working-class Catholics, while holding assets that could fund its operations indefinitely. Defenders argue that the Church's artistic and cultural heritage belongs to all humanity, that selling it would be cultural vandalism. Critics respond that maintaining palaces and art collections while people starve is a perverse priority. Pope Francis has tried to address this, emphasizing a church for the poor and criticizing consumerism and inequality. He's rejected some papal privileges, lived more modestly than his predecessors, and spoken forcefully about economic justice. But he hasn't divested the Church of its wealth, or fundamentally changed its financial structure. The contradiction between the Church's message and its material reality persists. The archives themselves represent another form of wealth. The historical documents, ancient manuscripts, and rare texts are priceless. Scholars dream of access to materials that could transform our understanding of history. But much remains restricted. Some documents are sealed for decades, others require special permission to view. The most sensitive materials may never be fully accessible. Why does the Church maintain such strict control over its archives? Officially, it's to protect fragile materials, ensure scholarly seriousness, and respect privacy. Practically, it's also about controlling the narrative. The Church can manage how its history is understood by controlling who can access which documents when. Embarrassing materials can be kept hidden. Damaging revelations can be delayed or prevented. The pattern of selective access means we know the Vatican's history imperfectly. We know what the Church has chosen to reveal or what scholars with access have published. We don't know what remains hidden. This makes writing Vatican history challenging. The gaps in our knowledge are significant, and we can't be sure what we're missing. Let's turn to another controversial area: the Vatican's relationship with organised crime particularly the Italian mafia. Sicily and southern Italy have been Catholic strongholds, yet they've also been mafia strongholds. How does the church coexist with criminal organisations? The relationship is complicated. The mafia has historically been composed of church-going Catholics. Mobsters attend Mass, baptise their children, contribute to church construction. Some have been deeply religious in their personal lives even while ordering murders and running criminal enterprises. This creates a cognitive dissonance that the church has struggled to address. For many years, the church avoided directly confronting the mafia. Priests in mafia-dominated areas served their parishioners, including those involved in organised crime, without publicly challenging the system. Some clergy were complicit, accepting mafia money or providing moral cover. Others felt powerless against organisations that would kill those who opposed them. The breakthrough came from individual priests willing to speak out despite the risks. Father Giuseppe Puglisi worked in a poor Palermo neighbourhood controlled by the mafia. He organised youth programmes to provide alternatives to criminal recruitment. He spoke out against mafia violence. On his 56th birthday in 1993, the mafia assassinated him. His death shocked Italy and the Church. Pope John Paul II visited Sicily shortly after and forcefully condemned the mafia, declaring that mafiosi would face divine judgment. It was one of the first times a pope had directly challenged organised crime. Pope Francis has gone further, formally excommunicating mafiosi in 2014 and declaring that mobsters cannot be Christians. But these papal statements don't change the reality on the ground. The mafia remains powerful in parts of Italy. Church officials in mafia territories must still navigate dangerous relationships. The institutional church has been slow to address how its theology and practices may have enabled mafia culture, how concepts like confession and redemption can be abused to provide spiritual comfort to criminals while they continue criminal activities. Documents in the archives related to the Church's relationship with organised crime are likely among the most sensitive and restricted. The full story of which clergy cooperated with the mafia, which church officials received mafia money, and how high up the institutional church this cooperation went may never be fully known. Another dimension involves the Vatican's diplomatic activities during various conflicts. The Vatican maintains diplomatic relations with most countries, and papal nuntios serve as ambassadors. This gives the Vatican a unique position in international affairs, allowing it to work behind the scenes in ways that surprise those who view the Church as purely religious. During the Cold War, the Vatican was actively anti-communist, but also worked to maintain connections with communist countries to protect Catholic communities there. This balancing act was delicate. The Vatican negotiated with communist governments for the appointment of bishops, trying to maintain church structure in hostile environments. In Poland, the Church became a focal point for resistance to communist rule. Pope John Paul II, the first Polish pope, supported Solidarity, the labour movement that eventually helped bring down Polish communism. The Vatican provided moral and financial support for anti-communist activities, sometimes in cooperation with the CIA and other Western intelligence agencies. John Paul II's role in the fall of communism was significant. His 1979 visit to Poland energised opposition to the regime. His support for Solidarity provided international legitimacy. His moral authority helped maintain non-violent resistance when violence would have given the government an excuse for brutal suppression. When communism collapsed across Eastern Europe in 1989, John Paul II could claim partial credit. But the Church's anti-communist stance also had costs. In Latin America, where the Church opposed communism, it sometimes supported brutal military dictatorships. The Church's commitment to opposing communism outweighed concerns about human rights abuses by right-wing regimes. Liberation theology emerged in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s, arguing that the Church should prioritise the poor and challenge unjust economic structures. Liberation theologians read the Bible through the lens of poverty and oppression, seeing Jesus as a revolutionary figure. They supported progressive social movements and criticised both capitalism and the Church's traditional alliance with elites. The Vatican condemned liberation theology. Both John Paul II and his enforcer Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, viewed it as contaminated by Marxist ideas. They disciplined liberation theologians, removed them from teaching positions, and pressured them to recant. The Church's opposition to liberation theology meant siding with the status quo in countries where the status quo meant poverty and oppression for most people. Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador became a champion of the poor and a critic of his country's military government. He spoke out against violence and injustice, using his authority as archbishop to draw international attention to El Salvador's civil war. On March 24, 1980, assassins shot him while he celebrated Mass. His murder was ordered by right-wing death squads connected to the military government. The Vatican's response to Romero's martyrdom was complicated. Some in the church hierarchy viewed him as troublesome, too political, influenced by liberation theology. His canonization process moved slowly, partly due to concerns about his political activities. It wasn't until 2018, nearly 40 years after his death, that Pope Francis canonized him as a saint. The treatment of Romero and liberation theology revealed the Church's priorities. It would tolerate, even support, authoritarian governments that maintained social order and traditional values. It would not support movements for social change that challenged economic structures, even when those movements emerged from Catholic communities applying Catholic social teaching. Documents related to liberation theology, to the Church's relationship with Latin American dictatorships, to cases like Romero's, fill sections of the archives. These papers reveal an institution more concerned with maintaining its position and opposing communism than with defending human rights or supporting the poor it claimed to serve. Let's examine the Church's modern financial scandals beyond just the Vatican Bank. The Church as a whole handles enormous sums of money through donations, investments, property holdings, and commercial operations. Financial management has been inconsistent, with some dioceses professionally managed and others riddled with corruption. In the United States, dioceses have paid billions in settlements to abuse survivors. These payments have bankrupted multiple dioceses, forcing the sale of properties and the closure of parishes. Financial investigations revealed that some dioceses hid assets, transferred property to avoid lawsuits, and manipulated bankruptcy proceedings to minimize payments to victims. The Archdiocese of New York, one of the wealthiest in the world, has been criticized for its financial opacity. It controls billions in assets, but has resisted calls for financial transparency. When Cardinal Timothy Dolan arrived in New York in 2009, he transferred millions into a cemetery trust fund, allegedly to protect those funds from abuse lawsuits. The transfer's legality was questioned, but they demonstrated how church finances can be manipulated to serve institutional interests. In Australia, investigations revealed that the Catholic Church was one of the country's largest non-government property owners, holding assets worth tens of billions. Much of this wealth was accumulated through government funding for Catholic schools and hospitals, combined with property appreciation. The Church's wealth stood in stark contrast to its pleas of poverty when facing abuse lawsuit liabilities. The Church's tax-exempt status in many countries allows it to accumulate wealth without paying taxes that other organisations would owe. This privilege is justified on the basis that religious organisations serve the public good. But when church organisations operate commercially, run businesses, or hold investments indistinguishable from secular corporations, questions arise about whether full tax exemption is appropriate. Pope Francis has attempted financial reforms, creating new oversight bodies and implementing transparency measures. But resistance from within the Vatican bureaucracy has been fierce. Financial reform threatens entrenched interests, disturbs established systems of patronage, and risks exposing past corruption. The battle over Vatican financial reform continues, with uncertain outcome. Archives related to church finances are among the most tightly controlled. Documents about money reveal where the church's priorities truly lie, show which individuals benefited from church wealth, expose relationships that the church would prefer remained hidden. Full financial transparency would revolutionize our understanding of how the church operates, but it remains unlikely. We should also examine the church's evolving relationship with science beyond the Galileo case. For centuries, the relationship was antagonistic. The church opposed heliocentrism, resisted geological evidence that Earth was far older than biblical chronology suggested, and rejected evolutionary theory. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. The Catholic Church's initial response was largely negative. Evolution seemed to contradict Genesis, to remove God from creation, to reduce humans to mere animals. Catholic intellectuals wrote refutations of Darwin, arguing that evolution was scientifically flawed and theologically dangerous. But the Church never formally condemned evolution the way it condemned heliocentrism. Some Catholic scientists and theologians argued that evolution could be reconciled with faith, that God could work through natural processes, that evolution described how God created rather than whether God created. This position gradually gained acceptance. Pope Pius XII in 1950 issued the encyclical Humani Generis, which acknowledged that evolution could be studied as a hypothesis, but insisted that human souls were directly created by God. This opened space for Catholics to accept evolution while maintaining human spiritual uniqueness. Pope John Paul II in 1996 went further, stating that evolution was more than a hypothesis and had been substantially proven. Today, the Catholic Church officially accepts evolution, operates astronomical observatories, and employs scientists in various fields. The Pontifical Academy of Sciences includes Nobel laureates and leading researchers. The Church has made peace with much of modern science, though tensions remain around issues like stem cell research and genetic engineering. But this reconciliation came late and incompletely. The Church spent centuries resisting scientific findings that contradicted traditional interpretations of Scripture. It disciplined Catholic scientists who challenged Church teaching. It created an environment where Catholic intellectual life lagged behind Protestant and secular institutions in scientific advancement. The archives contain documentation of these conflicts, theological evaluations of scientific theories, correspondence with Catholic scientists, discussions about how to respond to challenges to faith from science. These documents show an institution repeatedly caught between unchangeable doctrine and changing knowledge, trying to maintain authority while reality undermines its claims. The Church's moral teaching has also evolved in ways that create historical embarrassment. For centuries, the Church taught that slavery could be legitimate, that Jews were collectively guilty for Christ's death, that error had no rights, that religious freedom was a dangerous liberal idea, that democracy was incompatible with Catholic faith. These weren't minor positions or individual opinions. They were official Church teaching proclaimed by popes, defended by theologians, enforced by Inquisition. Catholics were required to believe these things. Questioning them could mean excommunication or worse. Yet all these positions have been reversed or abandoned. The Church now condemns slavery, rejects anti-Jewish theology, affirms religious freedom, and accepts democratic government. These reversals are positive but create a problem. If the Church was wrong about these fundamental moral issues for centuries, what else might it be wrong about? The doctrine of infallibility creates theological difficulties here. Papal infallibility applies only to specific solemn declarations on faith and morals, not to ordinary teaching or actions. But the Church also claims that the ordinary magisterium, the regular teaching authority of bishops and popes, is protected from error when it proposes teaching to be held definitively. How then did the Church teach moral errors for centuries? The usual answer is that these weren't errors, but rather developments of understanding, applications of principles to specific situations that changed as situations changed. Slavery wasn't intrinsically evil, the argument goes, but became incompatible with human dignity once that dignity was properly understood. This explanation is unconvincing. It means the Church taught for centuries that things were morally acceptable when they weren't, causing immense suffering that could have been prevented if the Church had seen moral truth more clearly. It suggests that the Church's moral teaching is time-bound and culturally conditioned in ways that undermine claims to timeless truth. Documents in the archives trace these developments. Bulls authorizing slavery, theological treatises defending it, correspondence about the slave trade, writings condemning religious freedom and democracy, anti-Jewish statements and accusations of deicide. These papers are historical evidence that the Church taught moral positions it now views as evil. The Church's handling of historical injustices reveals ongoing struggles. Consider the apologies Pope John Paul II made during the Jubilee year 2000. He apologized for the Church's sins, including religious violence, anti-Jewish persecution, mistreatment of women, and forced conversions. These apologies were unprecedented and courageous, but they were also vague and limited. John Paul II apologized for the sins of the Church's children, not the Church itself. He avoided specifics, didn't name particular popes or events, didn't change any doctrine or practice. The apologies acknowledged historical failures without accepting institutional responsibility or implementing reforms to prevent recurrence. Some injustices the Church has never adequately addressed. The Magdalen laundries in Ireland operated into the 1990s, institutions where unmarried women who became pregnant or were deemed morally wayward were confined and forced to work without pay. Thousands of women passed through these laundries, many suffering abuse. Babies born to women in the laundries were often taken for adoption, without the mother's consent. The Church ran these institutions for decades. Religious orders managed them. The state cooperated, sending women there through courts and social services. The system combined religious moralism about sexual purity with economic exploitation of free labour. Women who had committed no crime were imprisoned for years because they'd violated Catholic sexual ethics. When the scandal broke, the Church was slow to acknowledge responsibility. Some religious orders apologised. Financial compensation was eventually provided, mostly by the Irish government rather than the Church. But the institutional Church has never fully accounted for how this system existed for so long, how religious women inflicted such cruelty, how the Church's teaching about sexuality and sin created the ideological foundation for these institutions. Similar institutions existed in other countries. Mother and baby homes in Ireland, where thousands of children died from neglect and were buried in unmarked graves. Residential schools for Indigenous children in Canada, where cultural genocide was practiced, children were abused and many died. Orphanages and reform schools across the Catholic world, where children suffered abuse and exploitation. The Church's role in these institutions is documented but not fully disclosed. Archives related to religious orders that ran these places exist, but access is restricted. Survivors have fought for years to get basic information about what happened to them, to learn whether siblings they never knew existed might still be alive, to understand why they were treated so cruelly in institutions that claim to follow Christ's teaching about loving the vulnerable. This pattern of institutional self-protection at the expense of victims repeats across different countries and contexts. The Church prioritizes its reputation over transparency and justice. It releases information slowly, under pressure, in ways designed to minimize damage. It fights lawsuits, argues technicalities, delays and obstructs rather than acknowledging harm and making amends. The archives could answer many questions survivors have. They contain records of who was sent where, what happened to children born in Church institutions, which officials knew about abuses. But the Church controls access, decides what can be known, maintains power over the narrative even as it claims to pursue truth. Let's return to theological controversies that divided the Church internally. The modernist crisis under Pius VI wasn't the only time the Church suppressed theological innovation. The Nouvelle Theology movement in the mid-20th century faced similar treatment. Theologians like Henri de Lubac, Yves Congar, and Marie-Dominique Chenu sought to revitalise Catholic theology by returning to patristic sources and engaging with contemporary philosophy. They questioned neo-scholastic theology's dominance and proposed new approaches to understanding revelation, church, and salvation. Conservative theologians and church officials viewed Nouvelle Theology as dangerous innovation. In 1950, Pius XII's encyclical Humani Generis condemned various theological trends without naming individuals but clearly targeting Nouvelle Theology. Some proponents were removed from teaching positions, had their writings censored, or were otherwise disciplined. The irony is that many of these condemned theologians became the intellectual architects of Vatican II. When John XXIII called the council, he invited previously suppressed theologians as experts. Their ideas shaped major conciliar documents. Theology that had been dangerous in the 1950s became orthodox in the 1960s. This pattern repeats throughout church history. Innovative thinkers are condemned, sometimes for decades. Then circumstances change, the institution's needs evolve, and suddenly the dangerous ideas become valuable. Thomas Aquinas, now the Church's official philosopher, faced condemnations during his lifetime. Teresa of Avila, now a doctor of the Church, was investigated by the Inquisition. Ideas that threatened ecclesiastical authority in one era become safely incorporated into tradition in another. The archives document these cycles, investigations of theologians, censorship of their writings, rehabilitation years or decades later. These documents reveal an institution that struggles with intellectual innovation, that treats new ideas as threats to be suppressed, rather than possibilities to be explored. One theologian who was never rehabilitated was Hans Küng. A contemporary of Joseph Ratzinger, Küng questioned papal infallibility, criticised church authority structures, and advocated for major reforms. In 1979, the Vatican revoked his licence to teach Catholic theology. He continued as a scholar, but outside official Catholic theology. Küng lived into his 90s, outliving many who condemned him, never recanting, watching some of his critiques of church governance gain wider acceptance, while the institution that silenced him resisted change. His case demonstrates the cost of challenging church authority. Even distinguished theologians can be marginalised if they push too hard against doctrinal boundaries. The Church faces a dilemma. How can it claim unchanging truth while adapting to historical change? How can it maintain doctrinal authority while acknowledging past errors? How can it encourage intellectual inquiry while enforcing orthodoxy? These tensions are inherent in an institution that claims divine guidance while operating in human history. Documents in the archives related to these theological controversies are gradually becoming accessible as time passes. We can now read investigations of theologians from decades ago, see the arguments used against them, understand the politics that shaped doctrinal decisions. Future researchers will access more recent documents, revealing how contemporary theological disputes were handled, which ideas were suppressed, how the Church negotiated challenges to its authority. The relationship between the Vatican and various political movements in the 20th century adds another layer. We've discussed fascism and communism, but there were other complicated relationships. The Church's position on capitalism, for instance, has always been ambivalent. Catholic social teaching criticises capitalism's excesses, particularly its tendency toward materialism and inequality. Papal encyclicals from Rerum Novarum in 1891 through Laudato Si in 2015 have condemned unregulated capitalism, called for workers' rights, and demanded economic justice. The Church claims to stand between capitalism and socialism, offering a third way based on human dignity and the common good. But in practice, the Church has usually aligned with capitalist elites against socialist movements. The Church hierarchy generally consists of conservative men from privileged backgrounds who benefit from existing economic structures. Catholic institutions are often major property owners and investors with financial interests in maintaining economic stability. When forced to choose between capitalism and socialism, the Church has almost always chosen capitalism, despite its stated reservations. This tension became particularly acute during decolonisation. As European empires collapsed, newly independent nations faced choices about economic systems. The Church, deeply rooted in former colonies through missionary activity, had enormous influence. In most cases, Church leaders supported pro-Western, capitalist-aligned governments against leftist movements, even when those governments were corrupt or authoritarian. The Church's priorities were maintaining its institutional position, protecting its properties and schools, and opposing communism. These goals aligned with Western interests during the Cold War, leading to cooperation between the Vatican and Western governments. The Church received support from capitalist powers while providing legitimacy for their interventions in the developing world. Pope Francis has challenged this pattern more directly than any recent pope. His criticism of capitalism has been forceful and consistent. He's called unfettered capitalism a new tyranny, condemned the idolatry of money, and argued that the current economic system is fundamentally unjust. His encyclical Laudato Si connects environmental degradation to unjust economic structures. Conservative Catholics, particularly in wealthy countries, have been horrified. They accuse Francis of being a communist, of not understanding economics, of betraying Catholic support for free markets. They argue that capitalism has lifted billions from poverty, that markets are moral when properly regulated, that the Church should focus on personal conversion rather than structural change. This internal battle over economics reflects broader tensions about the Church's mission. Is the Church primarily concerned with individual salvation, preparing souls for the next life? Or does it have a mandate to transform unjust structures in this life, to build the kingdom of God on earth? Different answers lead to different positions on everything from economic policy to political engagement to social reform. The archives contain documentation of the Church's economic activities and positions, correspondence with capitalist elites, investments of Church funds, positions on labour movements, Responses to Economic Crises. These documents reveal the gap between the Church's stated social teaching and its actual economic behaviour. As we reach toward our conclusion, it's worth reflecting on what connects all these stories. 8 centuries of Vatican history reveal consistent patterns. The Church accumulates power and wealth, then struggles to maintain them. It claims moral authority while committing moral failures. It demands obedience while its own leaders disobey its principles. It speaks of eternal truths while changing positions on fundamental questions. It calls for transparency while maintaining obsessive secrecy. These aren't contradictions unique to the Catholic Church. They're inherent in human institutions claiming divine authority. When people believe they represent God, they can justify almost anything. They can inflict suffering while believing they serve good. They can defend the indefensible because admitting error threatens their entire worldview. The documents in the Vatican archives are evidence of this human institution's very human history. They show popes who are saints and popes who are scoundrels, clergy who gave their lives for others, and clergy who destroyed lives for their own gratification. Theological brilliance and theological nonsense, genuine faith and cynical manipulation. History is not simple. The Church isn't simply evil, despite its crimes. It's also built hospitals and schools, preserved learning through dark ages, inspired art and architecture, provided meaning and community to billions, produced saints and scholars and reformers. The same institution that burned heretics also fed the hungry. The same hierarchy that covered up abuse also opposed injustice. This complexity doesn't excuse the Church's failures. Doing good doesn't give permission to do evil. Building hospitals doesn't compensate for protecting abusers. Feeding the poor doesn't justify accumulating wealth, but it means the story isn't as simple as institutional evil. It's more complicated, more human. The question facing the Church today is whether it can learn from its history. Can an institution that claims infallibility admit it was wrong? Can a hierarchy that derives authority from tradition embrace fundamental change? Can a structure that has protected itself for centuries prioritize justice for victims? The answer may be no. The Church may be too invested in its current structure, too protective of its authority, too fearful of change to reform itself genuinely. It may continue managing crises rather than addressing root causes, making superficial changes while preserving fundamental problems. Or the answer may be yes. The Church has changed before, has reformed, has adapted to survive. Vatican II demonstrated that significant change is possible. Individual bishops and priests show what accountable leadership looks like. Catholic lay movements demand reform from below. Perhaps the combination of external pressure and internal conviction will force genuine transformation. The archives will continue documenting whatever happens next. Today's decisions become tomorrow's history. Today's secrets become tomorrow's revelations. The process continues. The documents accumulate. The story unfolds. For 8 centuries, the Vatican has kept its secrets, guarding them in temperature-controlled rooms beneath St. Peter's. But time is patient, and eventually most secrets emerge. The full truth may never be known, but we know enough to understand that the Vatican's history is far more complicated, far more troubling, far more human than official accounts acknowledge. These 53 miles of shelving hold not just documents, but evidence of humanity's struggle with power, faith, and truth. They remind us that no institution is above accountability, that authority without transparency breeds corruption, that claims of divine guidance don't exempt human organizations from human failings. As this journey through 8 centuries ends, the invitation is to think critically about institutions that demand unquestioning loyalty, to question authority that refuses oversight, to insist on transparency from those who claim to serve truth. The lessons from Vatican history apply far beyond the Catholic Church. They're lessons about how power operates, how institutions protect themselves, how secrecy enables abuse. If these stories have given you something to think about, if they've challenged assumptions or revealed history you didn't know, then this time has been worthwhile. The past shapes the present in ways we don't always recognize. Understanding that past, in all its complexity and contradiction, helps us navigate our present and build a better future. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, thank you for taking this journey through centuries of secrets, scandals, and power. Thank you for engaging with difficult history rather than turning away. And remember, the story continues. The archives grow, secrets eventually emerge, and the struggle between transparency and secrecy, between accountability and power, goes on. But there are still more dimensions to explore, more layers of this 8th century history that deserve attention. The Vatican's influence on culture, art, and intellectual life shaped Western civilization in ways both obvious and subtle. The Church wasn't just a political and religious institution. It was the primary patron of arts and learning for much of European history. Consider the Renaissance popes we touched on earlier. While Alexander VI represents the corruption of that era, other Renaissance popes made lasting cultural contributions. Pope Julius II, who reigned from 1503 to 1513, commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and hired Bramante to design the new St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Leo X patronised Raphael. These popes spent extravagantly on art and architecture, transforming Rome into a showcase of Renaissance culture. But this patronage came at a cost. The construction of St. Peter's Basilica required enormous funds, leading to the aggressive sale of indulgences that triggered the Protestant Reformation. The Church taxed Christians across Europe to build monuments in Rome. The artistic glory we admire today was purchased partly through the exploitation of the faithful, through the commodification of salvation. The Church also shaped intellectual life through its control of education. For centuries, most schools and universities were church institutions. Clergy dominated scholarship. The Church determined what could be taught, what ideas were acceptable, which books could be read. This control preserved learning through periods of chaos and barbarism. Monasteries kept libraries when secular culture collapsed. Church schools taught literacy when few others did. But this monopoly on education also meant intellectual stagnation. The Church taught what supported its authority and suppressed what challenged it. Philosophy became the handmaiden of theology, rather than an independent discipline. Natural philosophy, what we'd call science, had to conform to theological constraints. Intellectual innovation that threatened church teaching was dangerous for scholars who pursued it. The founding of universities in the medieval period created spaces for intellectual life, but these universities were church-controlled institutions. Faculty were clergy. Theology was the queen of sciences. Students took religious vows. The University of Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, and other great medieval universities were fundamentally religious institutions. This began changing with the Renaissance and accelerated during the Enlightenment. Secular learning challenged church monopoly. The printing press made books available outside church control. Scientific academies created alternative institutional homes for scholars. By the 18th century, the Church's intellectual dominance was broken in much of Europe. The Church responded defensively. We've discussed the Index of Forbidden Books, but the Church also tried to maintain control over Catholic education. It established seminaries to train priests in approved theology. It created religious orders dedicated to education, like the Jesuits, who ran schools and universities worldwide. The goal was to preserve Catholic intellectual culture, even as secular alternatives emerged. This tension between Catholic and secular education persists. In many countries, Catholic schools remain important parts of the education system, often receiving government funding. These schools preserve Catholic culture and values, educate millions of students, and provide alternatives to secular public education. But they also teach church-approved versions of history, present Catholic perspectives on controversial issues, and sometimes limit intellectual freedom in ways public schools cannot. The archives contain extensive documentation of the Church's educational activities, correspondence about university governance, theological textbooks, curricula for seminaries, guidelines for what can be taught. These documents reveal how the Church tried to shape minds, to create generations of Catholics who accepted Church authority and Catholic teaching without questioning fundamental assumptions. Let's examine the Church's relationship with women more deeply than we touched on earlier. The exclusion of women from ordained ministry is only one dimension of the Church's treatment of women. Church teaching about women's nature and roles has shaped Western culture's understanding of gender for centuries. Traditional Catholic theology, influenced by Aristotle and Augustine, taught that women were inferior to men in rationality and moral strength. Women were more susceptible to sin, more emotional, less capable of reason. These weren't incidental beliefs, but foundational to understanding human nature and gender roles. The story of Eve's role in the fall reinforced the idea that women were dangerous, that female sexuality was particularly sinful. This theological framework justified legal and social subordination of women. If women were naturally inferior, then male authority was natural and divinely ordained. Women needed to be controlled by fathers, then husbands, then sons. Independent women were threats to divinely established order. The Church didn't just reflect the misogyny of its time, it provided theological justification for it. Religious life offered women some alternatives to marriage and childbearing. Convents allowed women to live communally, to pursue learning, to exercise leadership within their communities. Some female mystics and saints achieved prominence despite gender barriers. But even in religious life, women's communities were subject to male authority. Bishops controlled women's orders. Priests had spiritual authority over nuns. Women could never escape male supervision within church structures. The veneration of Mary, Jesus' mother, created complicated dynamics. Mary was held up as the ideal woman, virgin and mother, submissive and powerful, human and almost divine. But this ideal was impossible for actual women to achieve. They couldn't be both virgin and mother. The glorification of Mary's exceptional holiness implicitly condemned ordinary women who couldn't match that standard. Catholic teaching on sexuality developed within this framework. Sexual pleasure was suspect, even within marriage. Intercourse was acceptable only for procreation. Women's sexual pleasure was particularly problematic, associated with Eve's sin and female weakness. These attitudes shaped Catholic sexual ethics in ways that caused enormous suffering, particularly for women. The prohibition on contraception fell most heavily on women. Men could claim that procreation required their participation, but didn't face the physical burdens of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing. Women bore all the physical costs and most of the practical burdens of unlimited fertility. The Church's teaching trapped many women in endless cycles of pregnancy that destroyed their health and truncated their lives. The Church's treatment of unmarried mothers represented extreme cruelty justified by theology. Women who became pregnant outside marriage had sinned grievously. Their children were illegitimate, stained by their mother's sin. These women and children deserved no compassion, only punishment and shame. This theological framework enabled the Magdalene laundries, the forced adoptions, the brutal treatment of vulnerable women and children. Vatican II brought some improvements. The Council affirmed women's dignity and equality before God. It opened some roles to women, allowing them to serve as lectors and extraordinary ministers of communion. But the fundamental structures of male dominance remained. Women still cannot be ordained, cannot preach at Mass, cannot make decisions at the highest levels of church governance. Pope John Paul II's theology of the body attempted to present a more positive view of sexuality and gender, while maintaining traditional prohibitions. He spoke of complementarity, arguing that men and women are equal but different, with distinct roles ordained by God. Critics pointed out that this complementarity always meant women subordinating themselves to male authority. That equality without equal power was meaningless. The archives contain centuries of theological writing about women, from medieval arguments that women lacked souls or full rationality, to modern attempts at affirming women's dignity while maintaining their exclusion from power. These documents trace a history of misogyny, of theological arguments used to justify the subordination of half of humanity. Contemporary Catholic feminists struggle with this history. Some work for change from within, arguing that the Church can maintain traditional teachings while treating women more justly. Others have left, concluding that an institution so fundamentally structured by patriarchy cannot be reformed. The exodus of women, particularly young women, from the Church in developed countries suggests that the institution's failure to address gender justice seriously is existentially threatening. Another dimension involves the Church's relationship with LGBTQ people, beyond what we've discussed. The Church's teaching that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered has caused immeasurable suffering, but the implications extend beyond doctrine into pastoral practice and institutional culture. For decades, the Church simply pretended gay people didn't exist within its ranks. Priests were celibate, the logic went, so their sexual orientation was irrelevant. This willful blindness allowed gay men to enter priesthood without acknowledging their sexuality, creating a situation where significant numbers of priests were closeted gay men leading double lives. This situation contributed to the abuse crisis in complex ways. Most abuse cases involved adolescent boys, leading some to blame homosexuality for the crisis. But this analysis confused orientation with behaviour. The vast majority of gay men, including gay priests, never abuse anyone. The problem wasn't homosexuality, but the closeted environment, the culture of secrecy, the lack of accountability. The Church's response to the abuse crisis included new restrictions on gay men entering seminary. Bishops were instructed not to admit men with deep-seated homosexual tendencies. This policy assumed that being gay made someone more likely to abuse, despite evidence to the contrary. It scapegoated gay men, rather than addressing the structural problems that enabled abuse. Meanwhile, many bishops who implemented these restrictions were themselves gay, or presided over chanceries where closeted gay priests were common. The hypocrisy was stunning. The Church preached against homosexuality, while its leadership included significant numbers of gay men living secret lives, some of them sexually active despite their vows. The Church's teaching also affected lay Catholics who were gay. They were told their orientation was disordered, that they could never have loving relationships, that they must remain celibate for life. Gay Catholic teenagers heard that they were fundamentally flawed. Gay adults had to choose between their faith community and their authentic selves. Families were torn apart when Catholic parents rejected gay children based on church teaching. Some dioceses and parishes tried to minister to gay Catholics with compassion, creating support groups and welcoming communities, but these efforts operated within the constraints of church teaching that condemned gay relationships. The message was, "You're welcome here, but your love is sinful, your relationships are illegitimate, your identity is disordered." Pope Francis's "Who am I to judge" comment offered hope to some gay Catholics. But subsequent statements and actions disappointed those hopes. Francis maintained opposition to same-gender marriage, described gender theory as ideological colonization, and failed to change church teaching or practice in ways that would genuinely welcome LGBTQ people. The archives surely contain documentation of the Church's evolving understanding of sexuality, debates about homosexuality, pastoral guidance on ministering to gay Catholics. These documents would reveal how church leaders understood sexuality, how they rationalized their teaching, how they responded to the human suffering their positions caused. The Church's relationship with indigenous peoples deserves deeper examination beyond colonization. Even after formal colonization ended, the Church's missionary activity continued shaping indigenous cultures worldwide. The goal remained conversion and transformation, turning indigenous peoples into Christians and implicitly into cultural Europeans. In North America, residential schools for indigenous children represented the Church's most sustained assault on indigenous culture. From the late 19th century through the 1970s, and in some cases the 1990s, indigenous children in Canada and the United States were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools, many run by Catholic religious orders. The school's explicit purpose was cultural genocide. The administrators aimed to kill the Indian in the child, to strip away indigenous identity and replace it with European Christian culture. Children were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their religions, or maintain their cultural traditions. They were punished brutally for any deviation from imposed norms. Physical and emotional abuse was systematic. Children were beaten for speaking their languages. They were sexually abused by priests, nuns, and staff. They were used as unpaid labour. They received inadequate food, clothing, and medical care. Disease was rampant. Thousands died, their bodies often buried in unmarked graves on school grounds. The trauma inflicted on these children rippled through generations. Parents who never learned to parent because they were raised in institutions struggled with their own children. Communities lost their languages and cultural knowledge. Addiction, violence, and dysfunction became endemic in communities that had been functioning before colonization and forced assimilation. The Church's role in residential schools is extensively documented. Religious orders ran the schools under government contracts. Church officials knew about the abuse and did nothing. The explicit goal of cultural destruction was stated openly, considered righteous work of bringing civilization and salvation to savages. In 2022, Pope Francis travelled to Canada to apologise for the Church's role in residential schools. It was an important symbolic gesture, but it came decades too late. Many survivors had died waiting for acknowledgement. And the apology didn't include financial compensation comparable to what the Canadian government provided. didn't address the Church's ongoing possession of relevant documents, didn't result in fundamental reforms. The archives contain records related to residential schools, reports from religious orders, correspondence about conditions, financial records, documentation of abuse. These papers could help survivors understand what happened to them, could identify perpetrators, could provide historical truth. But access remains restricted, controlled by an institution that has consistently prioritised its reputation over justice for those it harmed. Similar patterns played out worldwide. In Australia, the Stolen Generations saw Indigenous children removed from families and placed in church-run institutions. In South America, Indigenous peoples faced forced conversion and cultural suppression. Across Africa and Asia, missionaries worked to replace Indigenous religions and cultures with Christianity. Not all missionaries were cruel. Many genuinely believed they were helping, saving souls and bringing civilization. But the entire enterprise was built on the assumption that European Christian culture was superior, that Indigenous ways were primitive and damned. This fundamental disrespect for Indigenous peoples and their cultures justified enormous violence and suffering. The Church's current stance on Indigenous rights is more enlightened rhetorically. Popes speak about respecting Indigenous cultures, learning from Indigenous wisdom, protecting Indigenous lands. But this represents a dramatic reversal from centuries of Church practice, and it's not clear the institution has fully reckoned with its history of cultural destruction. Let's turn to another troubled area, the Church's relationship with Jews. We've discussed medieval persecution and the Holocaust, but the history of Catholic anti-Judaism is longer and more complex. For most of Christian history, the Church taught that Jews were collectively guilty for Christ's death, that their rejection of Jesus marked them as enemies of God, that their suffering was divine punishment. This theology, known as supersessionism or replacement theology, held that the Church had replaced Israel as God's chosen people, that the covenant with the Jews was void. Jews were to be tolerated but kept in inferior status as a warning to Christians of what happened to those who rejected Christ. They were subject to legal restrictions, forced to wear identifying badges, confined to ghettos, periodically expelled from Christian territories. The Church didn't initiate all anti-Jewish violence. Secular rulers and mob violence were often responsible. But the Church provided the theological framework that made Jews targets. Its teaching that Jews were Christ killers, that they were in league with Satan, that they posed dangers to Christian society, created the ideological foundation for persecution. During the Crusades, crusading armies massacred Jewish communities on their way to the Holy Land. The massacre of Jews in the Rhineland in 1096 was particularly devastating. Thousands were killed. Entire communities were destroyed. The Church condemned some of this violence but never questioned the theology that made Jews vulnerable. The medieval period saw blood libel accusations, claims that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood in religious rituals. These accusations were entirely false, but they led to massacres of Jewish communities. Popes sometimes issued bulls condemning blood libel, but local clergy often promoted these accusations, and church authorities didn't stop the violence that resulted. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, targeted conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. Thousands were tried, tortured, and executed. The Inquisition created an atmosphere of terror in Spain's Jewish community. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella expelled all Jews from Spain who refused to convert. Hundreds of thousands left, ending centuries of Jewish life in Iberia. The Church's teaching about Jews remained essentially unchanged until Vatican II. The 1965 Declaration Nostra Aetate repudiated the idea of Jewish collective guilt for Christ's death, condemned anti-Jewish persecution, and opened Catholic-Jewish dialogue. This was revolutionary, overturning centuries of church teaching. But Nostra Aetate also created tensions. If Jews weren't guilty of deicide, then what about all the previous church teaching that said they were? If the covenant with Israel was still valid, as later declarations claimed, then what was the point of converting Jews? These theological questions remain unresolved, creating ongoing debates within the Church. The Church's relationship with the State of Israel adds another layer. The Vatican only established diplomatic relations with Israel in 1993, decades after the state's founding. The Vatican's reluctance reflected multiple factors: concern for Christian communities in Arab countries, the status of Jerusalem and holy sites, theological discomfort with Jewish nationalism. But the delay also suggested that the Church hadn't fully accepted Jewish self-determination. Documents in the archives related to Jews include medieval legal restrictions, Inquisition records, correspondence about the Holocaust, debates about Vatican II's Declaration on Jews. These papers trace a history of persecution justified by theology, a slow movement toward repentance and dialogue, and ongoing tensions about how to understand the relationship between Christianity and Judaism. The Church's involvement in education and healthcare worldwide represents a more positive dimension of its work, though not without complications. Catholic schools educate millions of students globally. Catholic hospitals provide care in areas where government services are inadequate. These institutions represent genuine service, motivated by faith, helping countless people. But Catholic institutions also advance Church interests. Schools catechize students, aiming to create lifelong Catholics. They teach Church positions on controversial issues. In countries where Catholic schools receive government funding, there are ongoing debates about whether these schools can discriminate in hiring or admission based on religious beliefs, whether they can teach content that contradicts established science or promotes views many consider discriminatory. Catholic hospitals face similar tensions. They provide vital care but refuse procedures the Church opposes, abortions even when the mother's life is at risk, sterilizations, contraception, end-of-life options. In communities where Catholic hospitals are the only providers, this means people lack access to legal medical procedures because of religious restrictions. The Church argues that its institutions have the right to operate according to Catholic principles, that forcing them to provide services the Church opposes violates religious freedom. Critics respond that institutions receiving government funding or serving as the sole provider in a community should meet community needs regardless of religious beliefs, that religious freedom shouldn't mean imposing religious restrictions on those who don't share the faith. These debates are particularly acute around reproductive health care. Catholic hospitals won't perform abortions even when pregnancy threatens the mother's life, won't provide contraception even to non-Catholic patients, won't perform sterilizations even when requested by patients for medical or personal reasons. Women have been turned away from Catholic hospitals while miscarrying, denied emergency care because the fetus still had a heartbeat, forced to carry unviable pregnancies to term. The Church's position is that life begins at conception, that abortion is always wrong, that direct killing of innocent life can never be justified. This absolute position doesn't allow for exceptions even when continuing pregnancy threatens the mother's life. The mother must risk death rather than directly end the pregnancy, though the pregnancy can be ended if that's an unintended consequence of treating some other condition. This reasoning strikes many as cruel, valuing theoretical consistency over actual lives. But from the Church's perspective, it's maintaining moral principle against consequentialist reasoning. The debate reflects fundamentally different approaches to ethics and different understandings of when human life begins and what protection it deserves. The archives contain documentation of the Church's educational and healthcare activities, correspondence with religious orders running institutions, guidelines for Catholic hospitals, debates about controversial cases. These documents would reveal how Church leaders balanced service and evangelization, how they responded to ethical dilemmas in healthcare, how they justified refusing care that violated Church teaching. Another aspect of Church history involves the cult of relics and saints. For centuries, the Church promoted veneration of saints' physical remains and objects associated with them. Relics were believed to have miraculous powers, to heal the sick, to protect communities, to work wonders. Pilgrims travelled across Europe to venerate relics. Churches competed to acquire prestigious relics, which attracted pilgrims and their money. The relic trade was often fraudulent. There were enough pieces of the true cross in Europe to build a ship. Multiple churches claimed to possess the same saint's body. Bones of unknown origin were passed off as saints' remains. Con artists travelled selling fake relics. The Church benefited financially from this trade while officially condemning the frauds. The cult of saints also served political purposes. Monarchs promoted saints associated with their kingdoms. Regions claimed patron saints. National identities were partly constructed around saintly figures. The Church's control over canonization gave it power to shape these identity narratives, to recognize some figures while ignoring others. The process of canonization itself reveals the Church's priorities. Who becomes a saint? For much of history, it was founders of religious orders, bishops, and martyrs. Women saints were mostly virgins or widows, defined by their sexual status. Married women who weren't martyrs rarely achieved sainthood. The laity was underrepresented compared to clergy and religious. Modern canonizations reflect different priorities. John Paul II canonized more people than all previous popes combined, using sainthood to advance his vision of the Church. He elevated Josemaria Escrivá, founder of Opus Dei, a controversial conservative organization, while passing over more progressive candidates. He created saints from every continent, reflecting the Church's global expansion. The archives contain canonization records, investigations of candidates' lives, documentation of alleged miracles, debates about worthiness. These documents reveal what the Church valued, what virtues it promoted, which types of holiness it recognized. They also reveal the politics of sainthood, how canonization served institutional interests beyond simply recognizing holy lives. Let's examine the Church's response to scientific and medical advances beyond evolution. Stem cell research created major controversy. The Church opposed embryonic stem cell research because it involves destroying embryos, which the Church considers human lives. This opposition limited research in some Catholic countries and institutions, potentially slowing medical advances. The Church distinguishes between embryonic stem cells, which it opposes, and adult stem cells, which it accepts. But early in stem cell research, embryonic cells were more versatile and promising. The Church's opposition may have delayed treatments for devastating diseases, imposing the Church's understanding of when life begins on an entire field of medical research. Similar issues arise with in vitro fertilization. The Church opposes IVF because it separates procreation from intercourse, involves creating embryos that may be discarded, and treats reproduction as a technical process rather than a personal act. Catholic couples struggling with infertility can't use IVF if they want to remain in good standing with the Church. This teaching causes suffering. Infertile couples watch their friends have children while being told the most effective treatment is immoral. They must choose between having biological children and following Church teaching. Most choose to have children, using IVF despite Church opposition, but this creates guilt and alienation from their faith community. The Church's positions on these bioethical issues reflect its commitment to absolute moral principles over consequentialist reasoning. The Church argues that good ends don't justify immoral means, that some acts are intrinsically wrong regardless of outcomes. But this absolutism doesn't account for moral complexity, for competing goods, for the reality that most ethical decisions involve difficult trade-offs. End-of-life issues present similar challenges. The Church opposes both active means of hastening death and the withdrawal of ordinary care. But defining ordinary versus extraordinary care is difficult. Is a feeding tube ordinary care that must be maintained, or extraordinary intervention that can be withdrawn? The Church has struggled to provide clear guidance, leaving Catholic families in agony over end-of-life decisions. These bioethical debates will intensify as technology advances. Genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, enhancement technologies, and other developments will create new ethical questions. The Church's approach of applying absolute principles to complex new situations may become increasingly untenable, creating more distance between Church teaching and how Catholics navigate real moral dilemmas. The archives will document the Church's engagement with bioethics, Vatican statements on new technologies, debates within the Church about how to respond, pastoral guidance for Catholics facing these issues. Future researchers will see how the Church tried to maintain moral authority over scientific questions it barely understood, how it struggled to apply ancient principles to unprecedented situations. As we truly approach the end of this exploration, we must acknowledge what we don't know. The Vatican archives are vast and much remains hidden. We've traced 8 centuries using accessible documents, published sources, investigative journalism, but the most sensitive materials remain sealed. The full truth about many events may never be known. We don't know the complete extent of financial corruption in the Vatican Bank. We don't know all the details of how the Church helped Nazi war criminals escape. We don't know everything Church officials knew about abuse and when they knew it. We don't know all the political deals made behind closed doors, all the compromises with dictators, all the times moral principles were sacrificed for institutional interests. This incomplete knowledge frustrates researchers and survivors seeking truth. The Church controls the narrative by controlling access to evidence. It can delay revelations, release information strategically, shape how history is understood by determining what can be known when. But information leaks. Whistleblowers speak out. Investigative journalists uncover hidden truths. Time passes and documents become accessible. Slowly, persistently, the full story emerges. It may take decades or centuries, but eventually most secrets come to light. The Church can delay truth, but can't prevent it forever. What will future revelations show? Probably more of what we already know. More abuse that was covered up, more financial corruption, more political compromises, more examples of the Church prioritizing its interests over its stated values. The pattern is established. The institution's behavior has been remarkably consistent. Unless something fundamental changes, future scandals will echo past ones. But there may also be surprises, documents that challenge our understanding of events, evidence of greater complicity in atrocities, or alternatively of more resistance to evil than we knew, revelations that complicate the story rather than confirming existing narratives. History is always more complex than we think. The Church's future depends partly on whether it can learn from its past. Can it move from defensive crisis management to genuine reform? Can it embrace transparency rather than secrecy? Can it prioritize victims over institutional protection? Can it admit profound moral failures and change the structures that enabled them? These questions remain open. Pope Francis represents one possibility: reform within traditional structures, maintaining doctrine while changing practice, acknowledging failures while preserving institutional authority. But Francis faces fierce resistance from conservatives who view any change as betrayal, and many progressives see his reforms as inadequate. Another possibility is continued decline, at least in the developed world. The Church loses cultural authority, becomes marginalized, struggles to attract young people. It maintains its positions but becomes increasingly irrelevant to modern life. This is already happening in much of Europe. It may spread to other regions as societies modernize and secularize, or there could be schism. The tensions between progressive and conservative Catholics may become unbearable. The Church could split as it did in the Protestant Reformation and the Great Schism. This would be traumatic, but might allow different expressions of Catholicism to develop, without being constrained by a single institutional structure. Whatever happens, the archives will document it. Today's decisions will become historical records. Today's controversies will be studied by future historians. The process continues, the story unfolds, the documents accumulate in those temperature-controlled rooms beneath St. Peter's. For 8 centuries we've traced power and faith, corruption and holiness, human frailty and occasional transcendence. We've seen an institution that shaped Western civilization, that influenced billions of lives, that enabled both tremendous good and terrible evil. We've explored secrets that were hidden, revealed, or remain concealed in 53 miles of shelving. This history matters not just for Catholics, but for everyone. The Church's influence extended far beyond its members. Its teaching shaped laws, its institutions structured societies, its moral claims influenced cultures worldwide. Understanding its history means understanding how we got here, how power operates through religious authority, how institutions protect themselves sometimes at the cost of those they claim to serve. The invitation is to think critically, to question authority, to demand transparency, to insist that institutions claiming moral leadership actually live up to their stated values. These aren't anti-religious positions. They're demands that faith communities be faithful to their own principles, that religious authority be exercised responsibly, and that power be held accountable. If you've stayed through this entire journey, thank you. These are difficult stories, uncomfortable truths, complicated history. It's easier to look away, to accept simplified narratives, to not think too deeply about institutions we may have trusted. But truth matters, history matters. Understanding the past helps us navigate the present and build a better future. The secrets held in the Vatican archives belong to all of us. They're human history, documentation of our collective past. The Church guards them, controls access, determines what can be known. But ultimately, this history belongs to everyone affected by it, everyone who lived under Church authority, everyone whose ancestors' lives were shaped by these decisions made in Rome. As this exploration concludes, as you prepare to rest or reflect, remember that history isn't fixed. It's constantly being rewritten as new information emerges, as perspectives change, as we ask new questions of old sources. The story of these 8 centuries will continue evolving as more documents become accessible, as more voices are heard, as truth slowly emerges from secrecy. Wherever you are in the world right now, whatever time it is as you hear these words, you're part of this ongoing story. The past shapes your present. The secrets revealed or still hidden affect your world. And the choices you make about how to engage with institutions, how to demand accountability, how to insist on truth, those choices shape the future. Thank you for this time together, exploring 8 centuries of Vatican secrets. May you rest well, think deeply, and remember that no institution is beyond questioning, no authority above accountability, and no secret remains hidden forever.